The first time I smelled ether, it reminded me of lilacs and rot, sweet, then sickly, the way perfume lingers too long in a closed room. In Victorian London, that scent drifted through drawing rooms and theatres, curling around velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers. It was called sweet vitriol, and the upper classes treated it like air, something they deserved to breathe freely. Doctors praised it, debutantes whispered about it, and chemists sold it by the bottle to anyone with the right accent. Late at night, carriages rolled quietly through Mayfair, carrying men and women not to parties, but to ether frolics, where laughter came too quickly and limbs grew numb with euphoria. Addiction wasn't a word yet, neither was overdose. The same nobles who condemned gin drinkers and opium dens were inhaling ether behind lace curtains, their eyes glassy, their voices trembling between joy and madness. If you're new here, settle in with the hush of the hour. This channel tells the stories that history tried to forget. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever imagined what ruin might smell like when it's disguised as flowers. Because in the end, that's what ether became, the fragrance of Victorian self-destruction, delicate, invisible, and unstoppable. The smell came first, a sweetness too clean for the streets of London, too delicate for the breath of men who worked among coal smoke and horse dung. It floated out of the narrow doors of apothecaries and hospital wards, clinging to the cold air of the city like perfume that refused to die. Those who passed through Holborn or Harley Street caught it for a moment, the faintest whisper of lilacs wrapped in iron, and felt something they couldn't name: comfort, curiosity, dread. By evening, the scent had spread into parlours and drawing rooms, woven through velvet curtains and polished mahogany. Chemists called it ether. They sold it as if it was sunlight in liquid, form a cure for pain, melancholy, sleeplessness, or simply the weight of being alive. Doctors praised it as a modern miracle, and London, weary from progress and soot, was ready to believe. The city wanted relief. It had machines, telegraphs, railways, and revolutions, but no peace. Ether promised a kind of peace that could be inhaled. The first to taste it were surgeons. In the great hospitals of Street Thomas and Guy's, ether was used to silence the cries of patients before the knife touched skin. For a few blessed minutes the body belonged to silence. Men woke astonished that they had survived the impossible. The newspapers called it the triumph of science. But science has a way of seeping through locked doors. By the following winter, the same vapor that calmed operating rooms began to haunt the sitting rooms of Mayfair. They said it began with one woman, a baroness who suffered from hysterical nerves. Her physician, a cautious man with kind eyes, prescribed a few drops of ether to lift her spirits. She took it once, then twice, then began ordering more under the pretense of donating to charity hospitals. Her servants found her one afternoon seated by the fire, smiling faintly, her teacup still trembling in her hand. When they opened the window, the scent drifted into the square, and a passerby remarked how lovely the air smelled that day. It spread faster than rumor. London was a city of contagions: cholera, influenza, moral panic, and ether was the gentlest of them all. The wealthy inhaled it at dinner parties, claiming it sharpened the mind and softened conversation. They called it refined relief. Bottles were kept beside decanters and perfumes, tucked behind lace and silver. Some laughed when they fainted, others woke with tears streaming down their cheeks, convinced they had glimpsed heaven. But the servants noticed the change first, how their masters slept longer, laughed louder, and looked paler with every passing week. How rooms, filled with flowers, could no longer hide the chemical sweetness in the air. Some said the city itself began to smell of it, every breath laced with that same impossible perfume, as though London were holding one long, shallow inhale. No one called it addiction yet, not when it glittered among chandeliers and crystal glass, not when its victims still wore silk gloves and spoke French at supper. But beneath the laughter and the gaslight, something was already breaking. London had found its next obsession, and it smelled divine. And so, the storm began not with thunder, but with a fragrance. In the colder months of 1847, the frost never seemed to leave the glass. It clung to the edges of the city's windows like lace, a pale imitation of the finery that waited inside. Behind those windows, in the stately homes of Mayfair and Bloomsbury, ether gleamed in tiny crystal bottles, each one shaped to look harmless, even holy. Some were etched with gold initials, others hidden inside perfume flasks or medicine cases, but all held the same promise: one breath, and the world would dissolve into silk. It was the new fashion, though no one dared to call it that aloud. At first, the ladies spoke of it in coded phrases over afternoon tea. The vapor, they called it, or the tonic for delicate days. The more daring among them carried it in velvet pouches, nestled beside ivory fans and opal brooches. They claimed it soothed fainting spells and melancholia, but what it truly soothed was the gnawing emptiness that came after the orchestra stopped playing, after the laughter had grown thin. Servants were the silent witnesses. They refilled the lamps, emptied the ashtrays, and opened the windows each morning to release the scent that would not leave. They saw the ladies leaning over their mirrors, eyes bright as candle flame, lips parted as if confessing a sin only the glass could keep. They watched the men return from their clubs with unsteady smiles and bottles tucked in their coat pockets, claiming exhaustion from politics. One could find the source easily enough: a certain apothecary on Regent Street, always discreet, always paid in cash, kept a separate ledger for special orders. The names there were written in the faint, slanted hand of the elite: Lord Pembroke, Lady Harcourt, the Viscount's son. Every week the list grew longer. The apothecary's assistants learned never to meet the gaze of those who came for their little blue flasks. They were not patients, they were patrons. Ether was no longer a medical discovery, it was a luxury. Chemists began blending it with rose water, labeling the concoction as aromatic spirits of comfort. Perfume houses followed suit, releasing scents that imitated its sweetness without the danger, but everyone knew the difference. The real thing had a bite to it, a metallic chill that burned the throat and thrilled the blood. Late at night, when the gas lamps burned low, a hush would fall across the city. Only the faintest laughter drifted from shuttered houses, muffled by velvet and sin. Inside, the bottles passed from hand to hand, delicate as communion cups. Women in lace inhaled until the edges of the room blurred, and the ceiling seemed to pulse with light. Men leaned back in armchairs, eyelids fluttering, dreaming with their eyes open. Out in the fog, the watchman could sometimes smell it sweet and cold, like flowers buried in snow. They did not understand it, only knew it as the scent that clung to the city's most beautiful corpses. And behind the curtains, London held its breath, wrapped in velvet and vapor, pretending not to notice that paradise was beginning to rot. Dr. James Elwood had long believed himself a man of restraint. His handwriting was immaculate, his gloves always spotless, and his conscience, until recently, untroubled. He had been among the first to administer ether in surgery at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. A marvel, he thought, to see agony silenced and flesh yield without resistance. But as the seasons passed, he began to notice something peculiar. The faint pleasure on the lips of those just before sleep, that blissful sigh before the scalpel touched skin. It unsettled him at first, then fascinated him. What was this peace that lingered between pain and oblivion? He tried it himself one evening, after the hospital lamps were dimmed. A few careful drops upon a cloth, a slow breath. The world folded inward like the closing of a theatre curtain. The ticking of the clock softened. His own heartbeat became a drum muffled beneath snow. Then came the euphoria, an exquisite lightness, as though his body had forgotten it needed bones. He woke at dawn on his desk, the bottle toppled, the air still shimmering faintly with that impossible sweetness. He told no one, not yet. Instead, he began prescribing ether to his most delicate patients, ladies who complained of sleeplessness, widows haunted by nerves, poets whose minds ran too fast. He told them to take only a little, as one would sip champagne, but soon they wanted more, and he, with his quiet voice and spotless gloves, found himself their confessor. They came to him trembling, eyes wide, asking for another dose to steady the soul. He began to see the pattern, the shaking hands hidden behind lace gloves, the faint burns on lips where ether's chill had kissed too long. Yet he wrote the prescriptions anyway. London's high society adored him, Dr. Elwood, the modern physician, healer of minds, banisher of pain. He was invited to dinners, thanked in speeches, even painted once by a fashionable portraitist who caught that peculiar serenity in his eyes, the calm of a man living in two worlds. By autumn, he kept his own bottle in the pocket of his overcoat. He told himself it was for emergencies, but the emergencies came nightly. Each time he returned home to the silence of his study, the papers stacked neatly, the ticking clock unbearable. He would draw the curtain, soak the handkerchief, and vanish into the soft white blur. Outside, London roared and clattered with life. Carriages, bells, the cries of vendors. But inside his room, the air stood still. Ether made the world perfect for a few stolen moments until it wasn't. The dreams grew darker, the awakenings harsher. He found himself craving that first gentle drift again, that tender fall into nothing. But the more he chased it, the farther it receded, leaving only headache, trembling, and shame. He began to understand then what none of his patients could admit, that ether was not an escape from pain, but an apprenticeship to it. The city did not yet know it, but London was already addicted, one bottle, one doctor, one sigh at a time. The winter of 1848 arrived early, wrapping London in a grey stillness that seemed to muffle even the church bells. Carriages moved more slowly through the snow-slicked streets, and every breath rose in pale ribbons against the gaslight. Inside the gilded walls of the Kensington Assembly Rooms, the city's finest gathered for what the newspapers called the season's crowning affair. The chandeliers glittered like captured frost, and among the silk gowns and polished boots drifted that same invisible sweetness, the perfume of ether. Lady Amelia Harcourt, whose fortune was older than most of the men in the room, stood near the great window, pale even by candlelight. Her gloved hand trembled as she adjusted the fan at her throat. She had been told by her physician that a few drops of ether upon a cloth could calm her nerves, that it was entirely proper, even beneficial. But tonight, the trembling had worsened, and her reflection in the window looked like a ghost's, a woman blurred at the edges, dissolving into her own breath. Her maid had soaked the lace handkerchief earlier that evening. "Just a touch, milady," she'd said, though she knew it was never just a touch. The first breath burned cold, sharp as mint, making Amelia's eyes water. The second softened everything. The music grew distant, the air warmer, the laughter slower, sweeter. By the third, the ballroom tilted slightly, as though the earth had sighed beneath her feet. Around her, couples glided in perfect measure, their faces serene masks of civility. But Amelia noticed strange details, a woman's lips too red, a man's pupils wide as moons, a peculiar laughter that sounded more like weeping. She realized, with a kind of delicate terror, that she was not the only one breathing the invisible air. The scent came from everywhere, from jeweled handkerchiefs, from the sleeves of gowns, even from the mouths of men who leaned in to whisper compliments. London's high society was not dancing, it was floating. At the height of the waltz, her husband approached, smiling, proud, and unsteady. His words came like music through fog. "You look radiant, my dear," he murmured, though he could not quite focus his gaze. The heat of his breath mingled with her own, and she caught it, the same faint sweetness, unmistakable, rising between them like incense. The realization was almost tender. They were bound now by vapor, by ritual, by sin dressed as refinement. But as the orchestra swelled, the haze thickened, Amelia's pulse raced, her fingers tingled, and suddenly the room was too bright. She tried to steady herself on a marble column, but the marble moved, or perhaps she did. For a heartbeat, she felt herself fall backward into something vast and soft, the world spinning into white silence. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on a velvet chaise in the antechamber, a maid fanning her, guests whispering behind gloved hands. Someone said she had fainted, someone else said it was her corset. Only the maid knew the truth, that the faint scent of lilac still clung to the lace handkerchief, folded neatly in Lady Harcourt's hand. Outside, the snow kept falling soft, endless, and silent, and in the great houses of London, the first frost of addiction had already settled, glittering beautifully over decay. By day, Mr. Alaric Finch was a man of perfect composure. His chemist's shop on Regent Street gleamed like a cathedral to cleanliness, rows of blue and amber bottles catching the morning light, polished brass scales balanced with reverent precision. He served his customers in silence, never hurried, never careless, and his reputation for discretion made him indispensable. The wives of parliamentarians, the daughters of bankers, even a duchess or two, all found their way to his door with soft words and gloved hands. They came ostensibly for tonics and essences, but everyone knew what they meant. The word ether was never spoken aloud in his shop. It was written instead on small folded slips of paper, slipped discreetly across the counter like confessions. Finch would weigh the requests with a glance, his eyes flicking toward the street to be certain no constable lingered nearby, then disappear into the back room. Moments later, he would return with a vial wrapped in brown paper, the faintest trace of sweetness already leaking through the seal. He told himself he was a businessman, not a sinner. Ether was legal, after all, and in great demand. What harm was there in supplying comfort to those who could afford it? He had once apprenticed at a hospital, and still recalled the first operation he had witnessed. The screams, the blood, the helpless thrashing. Ether had silenced that agony. If it could banish pain so completely, why should he deny its gentler pleasures? Yet in quieter moments, guilt pressed against him like a hand on his throat. He kept 2 ledgers, one for ordinary sales, and one for the names that must never be known. The second ledger he locked each night inside a drawer beneath the floorboards. Its pages read like a map of temptation. Lord Pembroke, Lady Harcourt, Dr. Elwood, the bishop's niece, the opera singer with the scar on her wrist. Each week, more names. Each month, more bottles. He learned to read the signs, the shaking, fingers that could barely unfasten a purse clasp, the desperate brightness in the eyes, the way some customers inhaled deeply the moment the paper was handed over, as if the scent alone could carry them to safety. Once, a young woman fainted against the counter before she could reach the door. Her chaperone whispered that she had a weakness of the nerves. Finch pretended not to see the bluish tinge of her lips. As winter deepened, his back room became a secret world of vapor and silence. The air was always sweet and heavy. It clung to his clothes, to his dreams. He found himself lingering there after closing, the bottle uncorked, the fumes brushing against his mind like invisible fingers. The first breath filled him with calm, the second with clarity. By the third, he no longer thought of anything at all. Outside, the city gas lamps flickered in the fog, carriages rolled past, carrying his customers home to their illusions. Finch stood in the half-light of his shop, the shelves stretching around him like church pews, and wondered if he had become London's new priest absolving its guilt one bottle at a time. And somewhere far above the street, the scent rose through chimneys and cracks, drifting into parlours and bedrooms, sanctifying every sin it touched. It began as a whisper among physicians, a kind of genteel miracle murmured over brandy and cigars. Ether, they said, could calm the mind of even the most troubled lady. In an age where women's suffering was labelled as hysteria, nervous exhaustion, or melancholy of the womb, it offered an answer so simple that few dared question it. The tonic was elegant, odoriferous, scientific, a modern salvation bottled in glass. London's women were told they no longer had to suffer the tremors of grief, the fevers of anxiety, the despair of sleepless nights. A few breaths, and the storm within would pass. In Belgravia, parlours and Kensington boudoirs, the ritual took hold. A maid would draw the drapes, light a single candle, and place the vial upon a silver tray. A handkerchief was folded neatly, the cork turned just enough to release the chill vapor. The lady reclined upon her chaise, corset loosened, lips parted slightly as the sweetness filled her lungs. For a few exquisite moments, the noise of the world melted away. Pain, memory, guilt gone, replaced by a floating warmth that felt like forgiveness. Husbands approved. A composed wife was easier to entertain at dinner parties, easier to show off among guests. Ether became the silent companion of marriage, the invisible chain of domestic harmony. Mothers recommended it to daughters before weddings. Sisters shared bottles like heirlooms. It was no longer merely a treatment, it was etiquette. A fashionable woman was expected to know how to breathe it gracefully, to faint delicately when the world became too heavy. Dr. Elwood's name appeared often in the conversations that followed. A few drops upon the cloth, he had advised Lady Harcourt, taken only when necessary. But necessity, like grief, had a way of returning uninvited. One lady took it before playing the pianoforte, another before meeting her in-laws, yet another before confession, claiming it helped her speak without trembling. The clergy noticed the strange new serenity that entered the pews, parishioners kneeling with eyes half closed, whispering prayers that slurred into sighs. Servants began to recognize the signs, the faint sweetness clinging to bed linens, the sudden laughter at nothing at all, the eerie stillness that followed an outburst of tears. Many kept silent, fearing dismissal if they spoke of what they saw. A few whispered among themselves, calling it the sleeping sickness of the rich. They began opening windows after their mistresses' sessions, but the scent remained, seeping into wallpaper, upholstery, and dreams. By spring, London's chemists could hardly keep up with demand. Ether was sold under new names: Spirit of Serenity, the Gentlewoman's Solace, Aromatic Relief. The labels promised purity, the advertisements spoke of moral balance restored. In truth, the women who inhaled it were learning something far more dangerous: how to disappear while still sitting upright. It was the perfect illusion: obedience without chains, silence without despair, happiness without reason. They thought they had found their cure. In truth, they had only discovered how to make their suffering beautiful. And as the season turned, the sweet fog of their deliverance began to creep beyond the drawing rooms into the theatres, the carriages, and the hearts of every woman who wanted, just once, to stop feeling altogether. By the summer of 1849, the tremor had become fashionable. It began as a discreet flutter of the hand, a quiver so delicate it could be mistaken for refinement. Society ladies called it the delicate shiver, an elegant nervousness that spoke of sensitivity and modern strain. But behind the lace gloves and polite laughter, the truth was far uglier. The trembling was not born of emotion. It was the body's quiet rebellion, the faint toll of a habit gone too far. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The newspapers still called ether the angel's vapor, printing romantic anecdotes of surgeons and poets who had glimpsed serenity through its mist. Chemists placed new bottles in their windows, etched with gold lettering and wrapped in silk ribbon. The city adored the illusion of progress. It wanted its miracles neat, its vices scented, so the trembling went unspoken. Lady Amelia Harcourt's hand shook so badly she could no longer embroider. She claimed the lamps flickered too harshly, that the thread had grown thinner. Her maid, Anna, saw the truth in the mornings when she brushed her mistress's hair, the small blue veins pulsing at her temples, the greyish cast beneath her powdered cheeks, the way her fingers twitched even in sleep. Doctors began to see it too. They noticed the same pattern in their patients, their hearts racing, their skin cool to the touch, their laughter too sharp, too frequent. Dr. Elwood recorded his findings privately, afraid to publish. "They come to me seeking relief," he wrote in his journal, "yet each dose unravels them further. The vapor does not calm, it erases. Still," he continued to prescribe, "the city would not forgive him if he stopped. By autumn, The tremor had spread beyond the drawing rooms. In opera boxes, lorgnettes rattled faintly in trembling hands. At dinner parties, wine glasses chimed from nervous vibrations. Even in church, the devout could be seen clasping their hands tighter to still the invisible shiver. A soft sound began to follow London's evenings, the faint clink of glass against glass, not from celebration, but from bodies quietly losing their steadiness. Servants, ever observant, began to whisper. They said the vapor left its mark on the soul as well as the flesh. Some mistresses began to weep for no reason, others to laugh too long. One lady was found standing barefoot in her garden at midnight, convinced she was floating above the earth. Another mistook her own reflection for a stranger, and yet the bottles kept arriving, discreetly delivered in hat boxes and medicine chests, the labels rewritten each week in smaller script. No one dared to speak of addiction. That was a word reserved for sailors and gin drinkers, not for the wives of lords and parliamentarians. But the truth was written in every twitch, every sleepless night, every hollow smile. The same hands that once held fans and teacups now clutched at nothing, searching for the next breath of sweetness to steady them. London did not yet know it was shaking, but in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city's finest reached for their handkerchiefs, the sound of trembling filled the dark like the first whisper of an approaching storm. By the turn of the new decade, London's mirrors had become instruments of deceit. Every morning, women across the city leaned into their reflections, searching for proof that they were still whole. Yet the glass had begun to betray them. Behind the rouge and the pearls, there was something ghost-like in their faces, eyes ringed faintly blue, skin translucent beneath the powder, lips pale as salt, and still they smiled, as though the act itself could convince the world that nothing was wrong. Lady Amelia Harcourt had stopped recognizing herself. The mirror above her vanity, once a comfort, now shimmered like water whenever she leaned too close. Sometimes she saw her own face twist and ripple. Other times, she swore the reflection was breathing slower than she was. Each morning, she promised herself it would be the last time. Each night she reached again for the handkerchief, soaped and folded neatly beside the silver brush. The first breath always burned, the second made her forget she had sworn anything at all. The newspapers had begun to print warnings by then. Small notices tucked between advertisements for corsets and patent elixirs. Ether, though praised for its medical virtue, is not to be used for pleasure or experiment. Reports of nervous collapse and mania increasing among society ladies. But those who needed it most rarely read the papers anymore. They preferred the quiet rituals of their rooms, windows drawn, curtains closed, mirrors veiled in silk. The chemists kept selling. Mr. Finch on Regent Street, ever discreet, began to notice that many of his customers no longer asked for medicine. They simply left coins on the counter and waited for him to understand. He told himself he wasn't feeding their illness, only providing what the world demanded. Yet sometimes, after they left, he would polish the counter with trembling hands, scrubbing until the scent of ether faded from the wood. In drawing rooms, gossip took on a new delicacy. It was no longer polite to ask after one's health. A pallor was considered fashionable, a faintness poetic. The poets themselves had begun writing odes to ether, the vapor of dreams, the air of the divine. A young painter named Corbin showed his latest portrait at a private exhibition. A woman half vanished into white mist, her features soft and uncertain. Critics called it genius. Those who had breathed the vapor recognized it as truth. But the mirrors were the most merciless of witnesses. In their depths, the illusion faltered. Women began draping them in lace, claiming the light hurt their eyes. Others smashed them outright, leaving shards that glittered on the floor like frost. For some, it was easier not to see at all than to confront the stranger staring back. Outside, the fog thickened over the Thames, carrying that same faint sweetness across the city. It crept through cracks in the shutters, through chimneys and halls, until it mingled with breath itself. London was learning to live without clarity. its people reflected dimly in glass that could no longer tell truth from delusion, and in bedrooms lit by trembling candlelight, the frost on the mirrors waited patiently for morning, knowing the faces they would show would be fainter still. By the spring of 1851, London had a new kind of gathering. The invitations were written in lavender ink on thick parchment, sealed with wax embossed, not with initials but with a single crescent moon. They were passed hand to hand in whispers at opera houses and salons, never spoken of in daylight. The location was always different: a townhouse in Bloomsbury, a shuttered artist's studio near Russell Square, once even the back room of a bookbinder's shop. The guests arrived at midnight, cloaked in velvet and secrecy, their laughter trembling on the edge of hysteria. They called them ether frolics. Inside, the curtains were drawn tight, and the lamps were turned low. Bowls of violets filled the air with their faint perfume, carefully chosen to disguise the sharper scent of vapor that followed. At the center of the room stood a table draped in white linen, upon which lay a collection of delicate bottles, cut glass, silver stoppers, a chemist's altar turned to worship. Someone always brought music. A pianoforte played softly, or a violin bow whispering across strings. At first, it seemed like innocence. A few breaths to chase away the nerves of the day, a shared laughter, a touch of light-headedness, the thrill of forbidden modernity. But as the hours deepened, the sound of breathing grew louder than the music. The guests took turns pressing soaked cloths to their faces, eyes fluttering half shut, movements slowing to the rhythm of a dream. One observer, a young writer invited by chance, would later describe the scene in his journal. It was as if the air itself had become a narcotic, thick and humming. Their laughter turned hollow, like bells heard underwater. I felt joy and terror in equal measure, for they looked as though they had died beautifully. The hosts were often artists or philosophers, those who claimed ether expanded the mind. They spoke of transcending the body and peeling back the veil of reason. Yet for every visionary moment, there was another guest collapsed upon the floor, smiling faintly, skin pale as wax. Servants carried them to the window to revive them, fanning the air that had already grown too heavy to breathe. By dawn, the room would look like the aftermath of a séance. Empty glasses, spilled perfume, a broken hairpin, glinting in the carpet. Someone would open a window at last, and the sweet, metallic scent would pour out into the waking city. Passers-by might pause, catching the faint trace of it, thinking of flowers or frost without knowing why. When questioned, attendees spoke of the gatherings with practiced vagueness. A new amusement, they called it, a harmless distraction for weary minds. But among the servants and drivers who escorted their masters home, the stories took on a darker color. Some said the guests whispered to invisible figures, others that they moved in slow, looping circles long after the music had stopped. The ether frolics multiplied that summer, spreading from Bloomsbury to Mayfair, from the artists to the aristocracy. What had begun as curiosity had become ritual, a communion of the disenchanted, inhaling the same fragile dream until dawn blurred into delirium. And through the fog of laughter and perfume, London itself seemed to lean closer, drawn toward the soft, shimmering oblivion that its brightest souls now called pleasure. By the autumn of 1851, the city no longer smelled like coal smoke alone. There was something sweeter beneath it now, something foreign and delicate, a scent that drifted through theaters, opera houses, and private carriages. The newspapers called it the fragrance of progress, but the cabmen who drove the rich home from their midnight pleasures had another name for it. They called it the perfume of the damned. It began innocently enough. Perfume houses, ever attuned to the whims of fashion, discovered that the faint, metallic sweetness of ether could be bottled and sold. Inspired by the new age of medicine, one advertisement proclaimed, a scent to clear the mind and soothe the spirit. The mixture of rose, citrus, and ether vapor became the rage of the season. Ladies dabbed it behind their ears and upon their gloves, unknowing or perhaps uncaring that they were wearing the ghost of their own undoing. At Covent Garden, the boxes glowed with it. Gentlemen leaned toward jeweled shoulders that shimmered in candlelight, breathing the intoxicating blend of perfume and vapor. The air itself seemed alive, trembling with invisible heat. On stage, the soprano sang with such unnatural fervor that her audience swore they could see her breath glimmer in the gaslight. In truth, she had inhaled before the performance to steady her nerves, as many artists now did. When she collapsed behind the curtain after the final bow, the manager blamed her corset. Behind the glamour, the chemists thrived. Mr. Finch's discreet back room had grown into a small empire. He sold to perfumers now, mixing small amounts of ether into their fragrant oils. He justified it to himself as artistry, not vice. Only a whisper, he told his apprentice, just enough to make the scent memorable. But the whisper spread. Every ball, every concert, every fashionable street carried the same faint sweetness. The city itself seemed to breathe in time with it, as though London had become a single vast lung inhaling pleasure and exhaling decay. The first tragedies went unnoticed. A maid found her mistress asleep at her dressing table, head bowed upon a perfumed sleeve, her face still peaceful. The doctor declared it a heart ailment. Another woman was discovered in her bath, the air above the water glistening faintly, her skin scented like lilies. These were not scandals, yet only curiosities whispered at dinner. So graceful, someone said, as though they drifted away on a sigh. But the servants began to talk. They told each other that the perfume did not fade, that even after the body was removed, the sweetness lingered in the air for days, clinging to the curtains and the hairbrushes, impossible to wash away. Some claimed it drew moths in swarms at night, as if the creatures recognized something of death in its bloom. Still, the parties continued. Still, the opera houses filled. The scent became a signature of refinement, the hallmark of wealth and wit. And in the shadows of every ballroom, beneath the glow of chandeliers, the faint perfume wound its way through laughter and music sweet, cold, and unrelenting. It was the smell of beauty dying quietly, too elegant to scream. In the clubs along Pall Mall and St. James's, where politics and whiskey shared equal dominion, the men of influence gathered to inhale their own undoing. The gentlemen's cabinet of the Athenian Club, so named for its high ceilings and heavy scent of oak, was no longer merely a room for debate or cigars. By 1852, it had become something else entirely, a sanctuary for respectable ruin. It began with a handful of physicians and barristers who insisted the vapor sharpened their wits. A mind so clear it cuts through fog, one said after his first inhalation, his eyes glazed and distant. The idea spread faster than gossip. Soon, each club had its own circle of ether men who gathered after dinner, locking the doors, dimming the lamps, and drawing the heavy curtains. There, amid the gleam of decanters and the low hum of conversation, glass vials were passed like communion cups. Sir Reginald Blythe, a member of Parliament, prided himself on moderation in all things except this. To his mind, ether was not a vice but a tool, a way to rise above the dull noise of political compromise. It steadies the nerves before the vote, he said with a laugh that was too bright. His colleagues agreed. They swore the vapor lent eloquence, clarity, even courage. Some claimed to see visions of perfect order, laws that would mend society's ills, schemes that shimmered like divine revelation. But the next morning, when the haze cleared, the visions vanished, leaving only confusion and the slow crawl of shame. The servants who tended the clubs learned to avoid the cabinet after midnight. The air inside grew heavy and sweet, the same sweetness that had begun to haunt London's night streets. From behind closed doors came bursts of laughter that turned suddenly to silence, the sound of glass shattering, or sometimes nothing at all. Once, a butler found a member slumped in his chair, still smiling faintly, his eyes fixed on the chandelier as if admiring its distant stars. They carried him out quietly, claiming exhaustion. The newspapers called it a tragic seizure brought on by overwork. Yet no one stopped. The city's most powerful men now kept their own bottles hidden among the brandy and the inkstands. They called it the gentleman's reprieve. At parties they whispered recipes, ratios of ether to wine, ether to rum. In private diaries, they confessed to dreams of falling slowly through clouds, of hearing voices that spoke in perfect reason. But their bodies told another story. Tremors in the hands, paleness that powder could not disguise, sleepless eyes ringed with violet. Mr. Finch supplied them all. His deliveries arrived wrapped in discreet brown paper, labelled as pharmaceutical spirits. The ledgers of London's destruction were written in his calm, precise handwriting. Outside the cabinet, the fog rolled in off the Thames, thick with soot and sweetness. Inside, the men who ruled the empire leaned back in leather chairs, inhaling the very vapor that hollowed their hearts. They believed themselves gods of progress, yet in the dim amber light, surrounded by glass and shadow, they were only ghosts rehearsing their own extinction. Her name was Margaret Vale, though few remembered it by the time her story ended. She was one of those pale, capable women who seemed to exist only in the peripheries of other people's comfort, an unremarkable figure in grey wool, who guided the children of the gentry through their French verbs and moral lessons. In the great house on Cavendish Square where she worked, she was barely seen by her employers except at the edges of a corridor or over the sound of a piano lesson drifting through the afternoon air. But the servants saw her often, and they noticed when she began to fade. It started quietly. The lady of the house, prone to nerves and fainting fits, had recently taken to her ether tonic. The chemist's bottle stood proudly among the perfumes and tinctures on her dressing table. Margaret was the one ordered to fetch it, to hold the cloth steady as her mistress inhaled, to wipe her brow and whisper calming words. At first, Margaret found the scent unbearable, too sweet, too sharp, but her mistress's sigh afterward was so serene that it lingered in her mind long after she returned to the schoolroom. The children were restless that day. The eldest boy had broken his slate. The youngest girl kept humming the same song until Margaret's temples throbbed. The air felt heavy, as if the whole house were wrapped in fog. When the mother called from her chambers again, Margaret hurried upstairs, relieved for any excuse to leave the noise behind. Her mistress was asleep, the vial still open on the table beside her. The cloth lay folded in perfect stillness, the air shimmering faintly in the candlelight. Margaret hesitated. The scent filled the room like a lullaby. She had not slept well in months. Her head often ached. The children's laughter sometimes sounded like bells underwater. Surely, she thought, a small breath would do no harm. She leaned closer. The first inhalation burned, catching in her throat, but the next one melted into something cool and soothing. Her pulse slowed. The room softened around her, edges blurring, as if painted with water. For the first time in years, she felt light, so light, she feared she might float away entirely. No one knew how long she stood there before collapsing into the chair by the fire. Hours passed. The candle burned low, and the clock downstairs struck midnight. When the lady's maid entered at dawn, she found both women still sleeping, the mistress breathing faintly, the governess unnaturally still. The physician arrived later that morning, expression grim but practiced. Exhaustion, he said, writing it down with a sigh. The governess had been overworked, a fainting fit, nothing more. He asked that the matter be kept discreet. The family agreed. Within a week, another woman had taken Margaret's place in the schoolroom, her presence already dissolving from memory. Yet the servants continued to whisper. They said her ghost still lingered in the nursery, a faint perfume of sweetness that rose whenever the children grew quiet. Sometimes, in the still hours before dawn, they swore they could hear a woman's soft breath, steady and rhythmic, as though she were still trying gently, endlessly to wake. When dawn crept into London, it brought no peace. The light, thin and colourless, revealed what the night had hidden: the scattered glasses, the half-burned candles, the guests who had lingered too long in their dreams. In the parlours of Bloomsbury and the drawing-rooms of Mayfair, the air still shimmered faintly with that cloying sweetness. Curtains remained drawn, and servants moved quietly through the wreckage, gathering shawls, polishing silver, and stepping over the faint outline of the previous night's joy. Ether had a strange way of distorting time. What began as laughter and brilliance ended always in silence, and the silence was heavier than anyone expected. The night's indulgence left its trace not in bottles or stains, but in the hollow feeling behind the eyes, the tremor in the voice, the sudden dread of remembering nothing at all. When the city awoke, its finest citizens were already retreating from the light. Lady Amelia Harcourt sat at her breakfast table with her gloves still on. The tea before her had long gone cold. Her husband, equally pale, stared into the paper without reading it. Between them, the morning ticked by like a clock losing its rhythm. They had danced the night before, or so she thought. She could not quite remember. Her gown still smelled of lilacs and ether. When she looked at her reflection in the silver teapot, her face seemed to shimmer slightly, like a photograph exposed to sunlight. Elsewhere, in a grand house on Bedford Square, the aftermath was less polite. A guest had been found collapsed near the balcony, her laughter still echoing faintly in the air. The physician called it syncope, a fashionable faint. The hostess, refusing scandal, ordered the carpets changed and the drapes washed. By evening, the room would be ready again, the music returning as though nothing had happened. But the servants knew better. They were the ones who saw the truth in the mornings, the pale faces, the shaking hands, the stains on, the lace cuffs from spilled ether. They whispered that the city was bewitched, that the vapor carried a spirit that fed on pleasure and left only emptiness behind. Some refused to enter their employers' rooms until the windows had been opened. Others began wearing scarves soaked in vinegar to block out the smell. Yet the sweetness always crept through. Mr. Finch, the chemist, noticed the pattern too. His customers no longer arrived, smiling and curious, but haunted, anxious, apologetic. They asked for stronger mixtures, purer distillations. He told himself he was helping them, but their trembling hands said otherwise. The ledger that once brought pride now filled him with unease. Every name was a confession written in ink. By midday, London returned to its noise and clatter, but beneath the surface something had shifted. The laughter that once floated through its ballrooms now carried an echo, a hollow note of fear, faint but growing. The city's pleasure had begun to sour, and those who once glowed under its light now flinched from their own reflections. In the streets outside, the fog pressed low, as if the sky itself were tired. The scent lingered in the morning air, a ghost of sweetness clinging to the cold. And though the sun rose faithfully, London moved through the day half awake, half ashamed, waiting for night to fall again. By 1853, the beauty of London's high society had begun to decay, but it did so gracefully. Powdered faces still smiled beneath chandeliers, jeweled hands still lifted glasses, but the glow had dulled, replaced by a brittle shimmer that cracked when seen too closely. The city was rotting in perfume, and the rot smelled divine. Doctors had begun to notice strange new symptoms. Women who looked radiant at dusk appeared ashen by dawn. Their hearts fluttered irregularly, their skin turned cold as marble, and a faint bruising bloomed beneath their eyes, hidden poorly by rouge. Men, too, were faltering, voices slurred, pupils blown wide, their laughter brittle and mechanical. Yet society refused to call it illness. To acknowledge sickness was to confess excess, and confession was unfashionable. So they gave it prettier names: fatigue of the season, nerves of refinement, vapor's melancholy. Lady Amelia Harcourt had learned to live by candlelight. The daylight made her dizzy now. She claimed the sun felt too loud. The servants were forbidden to open the curtains in her rooms. Every morning, they found her asleep in her chair, her teacup untouched, the faint smell of ether floating above her like incense. When her husband tried to intervene, she smiled with that distant gentleness. Addicts wear the expression of one who believes she's transcended ordinary human frailty. "I only take it for comfort," she murmured, "just enough to breathe." In truth, her comfort was killing her. Her hands shook so violently she could no longer play the pianoforte. Her letters grew unreadable, ink blurring from the tremor. She hid her shame with gloves, long and white, the kind worn by brides, yet her guests noticed the strange pallor of her lips, the faint glaze over her eyes, the way her laughter seemed a beat too slow, as though the sound had to climb up from somewhere far below. The same sickness spread quietly across the city. Seamstresses whispered that their noble clients no longer came for fittings but for fainting couches. Servants reported their masters sleeping entire days away, waking only to call for their bottles. The chemists grew richer. Mr. Finch's apprentices wore handkerchiefs over their noses, yet still came home dizzy, their clothes soaked in the vapor's ghostly sweetness. The newspapers tried to stir alarm, one anonymous editorial called Ether, the aristocrat's plague, but the article was quickly withdrawn. Too many names were entangled in the trade, too many fortunes depended upon the silence, and London, addicted to its own elegance, could not bear to look at the filth behind its beauty. By summer, even the flowers on the window ledges seemed to wilt faster, their petals edged in brown. The scent of decay had become indistinguishable from perfume. The carriages that rolled through Mayfair at twilight carried passengers who no longer spoke, their eyes half closed, their faces serene in the dim glow. They looked like saints in the process of dying, and in a way, they were their souls dissolving not from sin or scandal but from the sweetest rot ever devised by human hands. Dr. James Elwood had once been the pride of Street Bartholomew's. His lectures on modern anesthesia drew crowds of eager students. His surgical precision was renowned. Yet by the mid-1850s, the man who had brought silence to the operating theatre found himself haunted by it. The stillness he had once called mercy now clung to him like guilt. He could not close his eyes without hearing it, the absolute, unnatural quiet of a patient breathing vapor instead of air. He still performed operations, though less often. The young assistants noticed how his hand sometimes hovered above the scalpel, trembling, as if waiting for permission. They noticed, too, the bottle he kept near his desk, not the small, clean glass of the hospital supply, but a private one, with its label worn smooth from use. When asked, he said it was for demonstration. None of them dared to question further. He told himself he used it to think. A drop upon a cloth after the day's last patient, a single breath to ease the tension from his chest. But lately, one breath was never enough. The vapor that once granted clarity now blurred his thoughts in a haze both terrible and tender. He could no longer distinguish between relief and surrender. Letters arrived daily from wealthy patrons requesting his services not for surgery, but for private therapy. They wanted what he had promised years ago: pain without consequence, sleep without memory. One woman even offered him a fortune to administer the vapor to her dying husband, so that his final hour might pass like a dream of angels. Elwood refused at first, then relented. He told himself it was compassion, not commerce. When the man's breathing slowed and stilled beneath the mask, the widow wept with gratitude. She pressed gold coins into Elwood's hand and whispered, "You have spared him the agony of truth." That night, Elwood returned home and poured the coins into the fire. The flames burned blue. He began to notice the irony of his profession. In lecture halls, he warned of the dangers of overuse. In parlors and bedchambers, he provided it freely. His name appeared in gossip columns now, attached to rumors of noble ladies fainting in his arms. He was not flattered. Each story felt like a noose tightening around his reputation. By winter, he could no longer sleep without the cloth pressed to his face. The dreams it gave him were gentle at first, visions of light, of clean air, and silent rooms, but they soon darkened. He dreamed of his patients rising from their tables, their mouths open but voiceless, their eyes clouded by the same vapor that filled his lungs. The hospital board summoned him once, quietly, to discuss concerns. He arrived late, smelling faintly of the chemical he had introduced to Britain's veins. They spoke of discipline, of propriety, of faith in medicine. Elwood nodded, promised improvement, and walked out into the fog-slicked streets. That night, as he prepared another cloth, he caught his reflection in the dark window, pale, hollow, trembling, and understood that London was not the only body he had infected. He had taught a nation how to escape its pain, and now neither he nor his city could remember what it meant to feel awake. By 1854, the hospitals of London had become theatres of silence. The surgeons moved like actors behind gauze curtains, their breath echoing inside the glass masks that had come to symbolize progress. The operation rooms glowed with lamplight reflected off steel and tile, and everywhere there was that scent, sweet, metallic, and faintly cold. Ether had become the language of mercy, the signature of modern medicine. Yet beneath the precision and civility, something darker began to stir. No one could deny its power. A patient could have a limb removed, a tumor excised, and wake with no memory of agony. Mothers blessed the doctors who delivered babies without screams. Soldiers thanked them for painless amputations. But as the miracle became routine, so too did its quiet corruption. The doctors began to linger over their instruments, inhaling the vapor themselves before each procedure. To steady the nerves, they said, to focus the hand. But some did not stop when the scalpel was set down. At St. Thomas's, Dr. Elwood's students noticed the change. Operations grew longer, his eyes slower to blink, his speech too soft and measured, as if he were whispering to ghosts. He insisted on performing every demonstration himself, even when his assistants offered to take his place. The nurses began to dread the nights he stayed late, his shadow moving behind the frosted windows of the surgical theatre, long after the lamps should have been extinguished. It was said that the hospital's night porters once found him seated before an empty operating table, the mask pressed to his face, his hands trembling. The vapor curled through the air in ribbons, lit pale blue by the dying lamps. He looked up when they entered and smiled faintly. "It listens," he murmured, "when I breathe deeply enough." Outside the hospitals, society applauded the same device for more frivolous reasons. The mask had escaped into private homes, smaller, sleeker versions, sold to the wealthy under the pretense of restorative inhalation. The fashion houses carried them in velvet cases, marketed as modern luxuries. The ladies called them midnight masks. Some even decorated the glass with silver filigree and ribbons, as though suffering itself had become an accessory. Behind closed doors, the ritual was almost religious. A woman would recline on her chaise, a maid adjusting the straps while a husband watched, fascinated by the serene stillness that followed. The breathing slowed, the eyes fluttered. For a moment, the world vanished into perfect peace. Some called it sleep, others rapture. But when the maid unfastened the mask again, the color had already drained from the lady's lips. The newspapers buried the stories in their back pages. Tragic death of a young heiress, sudden collapse of a surgeon. No mention of the vapor, only polite euphemisms, exhaustion, stress, the strain of city life. In truth, London itself wore the mask now. The city inhaled through its chimneys and exhaled through its fog, numbing itself against its own progress. And beneath the glow of the gas lamps, where the surgeons and the sinners both walked home with trembling hands, the line between healing and surrender had all but disappeared. It began, as scandals often do, with a fainting fit in the wrong room. In the spring of 1855, Lady Clara Hensley was hosting one of her famous soirees at her home on Cavendish Square, a gathering of poets, doctors, and dignitaries eager to praise the marvels of progress. The city's elite came dressed in silk and speculation, toasting to railways and revolutions, to the empire's endless appetite. Ether, though never mentioned aloud, floated invisibly among the guests, its fragrance sweetening the air more effectively than any perfume. Lady Clara was known for her composure, for the kind of beauty that seemed carved rather than born. Yet that night, as she rose to read a few lines of her husband's latest poem, her voice caught mid-sentence. A silence rippled through the room. She swayed once, twice, then fell backward, with a strange, graceful slowness, like a petal detaching from its stem. The guests gasped. The pianist stopped mid-chord. Her husband rushed forward, shouting for a doctor. Dr. Elwood happened to be present. He had been invited as an ornament of modern science, a living emblem of civilized medicine. Pushing through the crowd, he knelt beside her. Her pulse was faint, her breath shallow but fragrant. He recognized it instantly. That same cold sweetness, that trace of the vapor he himself could not live without. He looked up and saw the truth in her husband's eyes before either of them spoke. "Fetch a fan," Elwood said quietly, though he knew it was useless. The handkerchief that had fallen from her grasp still shimmered faintly with the scent of ether. She had not fainted from nerves or heat. She had simply slipped too far into the dream she had been chasing for months. The room buzzed with confusion. Someone opened a window, and the night air rushed in, scattering perfume, panic, and whispers. The poet's wife had died before the audience she'd been meant to enchant. The newspapers could not resist. They wrote of the mysterious collapse of a society hostess, of nervous exhaustion following illness. But the servants of Cavendish Square knew otherwise. They told of bottles hidden in drawers, of late-night laughter followed by silence, of the strange chemical odor that lingered long after her body was carried away. For the first time, ether had a name attached to tragedy. Private conversations turned anxious, chemists grew discreet, Parliament debated whether the substance should be restricted, but too many of those seated in the chamber had breathed its promise themselves. So the matter was tabled indefinitely. Dr. Elwood retreated further into isolation after the incident. He claimed illness, but in truth, he could not bear the sight of lamplight or mirrors. He spent his nights wandering the fogged streets, seeing Lady Clara's face reflected in every window, a vision both beautiful and damning. In the mornings, the scent still lingered around Cavendish Square, faint but unmistakable. London had learned something that night, though none would admit it aloud, that death, when dressed in refinement, could still draw a crowd. And ether, like all fashionable poisons, would only grow more desirable for the scandal it left behind. By the winter of 1855, Mr. Alaric Finch's apothecary had become a confessional for the desperate and the damned. The bell above the door no longer rang cheerfully, it sighed. Its soft chime meant another visitor come not for medicine, but for salvation. Salvation bottled in glass and sealed with guilt. The frost had crept over Regent Street, the gas lamps burning through mist so thick that night and morning had begun to look the same. And yet the small shop remained open late, a single golden square of light in the grey. He could tell the hour by his customers. The early ones were the proper sort, servants running errands, nurses seeking antiseptics. But as evening deepened, the tone changed. Gloves replaced work-worn hands, voices dropped to whispers, and the sweet, unmistakable word ether hid behind euphemisms. A restorative for nerves, a draught for the lungs, a little of the spirit that steadies. Each phrase meant the same thing, and Finch, ever discreet, obliged without question. Tonight, the fog pressed against the windows like breath. Inside, the air shimmered faintly with the scent of spilled vapor. He had stopped noticing when his hands began to tremble, when his apprentice started stammering mid-sentence. It was not the trembling that unnerved him, it was the silence between sales. That silence was heavy with confession. A coach arrived outside just after 10. A woman stepped down, veiled, her posture betraying the practiced grace of wealth. Her gloved hand left faint marks of frost on the counter as she leaned close. "You know what I need," she whispered, as before. "Stronger, if you can." Finch hesitated. Her voice was the kind that carried command even when breaking. He had seen her many times before, Lady Harcourt's companion, perhaps, or one of the nameless wives whose beauty had begun to fade beneath powder and pallor. Her eyes were glassy, her pupils wide and wild. "I've heard," she continued, "that yours is purer than the others. They say it never fails." He nodded, turned, and unlocked the cabinet behind him. His hands moved automatically, measuring, pouring, sealing, as though guided by someone else's will. As he wrapped the bottle in brown paper, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the cabinet glass. Hollow cheeks, eyes ringed with fatigue. He barely recognized himself. "Do you ever take it?" the woman asked suddenly. He froze, the string between his fingers tightening. "No," he lied, though the truth lived in his lungs. She smiled, as if she understood. "We all breathe the same air now, Mr. Finch. There's no escaping it." When she left, her perfume lingered with the sharper sweetness of ether, blending until he could no longer tell one from the other. He locked the door, turned the sign to closed, and stood in the quiet. Outside, the city was sleeping restlessly beneath its fog. Inside, he uncorked a bottle and drew one slow, steady breath. The whispers were still there, every voice that had come to his counter, every plea, every secret. They filled the room like the hiss of a dying flame, and as the night wore on, London's most discreet apothecary felt the weight of his own sin, pressing gently against his throat, soft as vapor and just as inescapable. The fever of ether did not spare the artists. By 1856, Bloomsbury's garrets glowed through the night with the shimmer of candlelight and fumes, the air thick with paint, turpentine, and that same intoxicating sweetness. To the poets and painters who crowded the salons and studios, ether was not a drug but a muse. They called it the breath of vision. The doctors and priests called it madness. Among them was Julian Corbin, a painter of extraordinary promise, whose portraits were said to capture not likeness but spirit. His early works hung already in the galleries of Pall Mall. Young women seated in gardens of impossible color, faces glowing with that half-angelic, half-haunted beauty so fashionable in the new decade. Critics praised his transcendent realism. No one noticed that the women he painted were pale as ghosts, nor that he had begun to smell faintly of something sharper than linseed oil. It was a fellow artist, a sculptor, who first brought the vapor to Julian's studio. "One breath," he promised, "and you'll see color the way God must see it." Julian laughed, but accepted. The first inhalation burned his throat. The second filled his chest with light. When he opened his eyes again, the world was not what it had been. The lamplight fractured into halos, the dust motes shimmered like stars, and the face of the woman sitting for him seemed to dissolve into pure radiance. He painted feverishly through the night, each stroke more frantic, more alive. When dawn came, he wept at what he had made a vision so beautiful it frightened him. He told himself he would only use it for inspiration. But the inspiration demanded repetition. Soon every canvas began with a bottle uncorked, every brush stroke guided by that silent sweetness. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. His sitters complained that he frightened them. They said he muttered to himself as he worked, describing colors no one else could see. A blue that hums, a red that breathes. The critics adored his decline. "There is something unearthly in Corbin's latest pieces," wrote one reviewer. "His subjects appear suspended between this life and the next. He sold everything he painted, even as his health failed. The money he earned he spent on more ether, and the friends who once visited his studio stopped knocking when they noticed the fumes leaking from beneath the door. One fog-bound morning, a neighbor forced the lock after days without seeing movement inside. They found him slumped beside his easel, a half-finished canvas before him. The face on the canvas was his own, painted with exquisite care, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as though exhaling a final breath. The hand that held the brush was stiff, but the color upon the palette glowed strangely, shimmering even in the weak daylight. The newspapers printed it as another tragic case of artistic temperament. The critics mourned him as a martyr to beauty. But in the alleys behind the galleries, whispers spread that he had not died alone, that the vapor had entered the paint itself, that his last exhalation still lingered in the colors. And in the months that followed, those who stood too long before his paintings swore they could smell something faintly sweet, almost floral, a perfume that made the heart race and the eyes sting, as if London's ghosts were still breathing through the art they had inspired. By the spring of 1857, Even the churches had begun to smell faintly of ether. It drifted in from the gloves and shawls of the faithful, carried upon the breath of those who came seeking salvation with trembling hands. The pews were filled with pale faces, women who fainted too easily, men whose eyelids fluttered like candle flames. The clergy spoke of sin, of self-control and temperance, but their words dissolved into the thick perfume of sanctified decay. The Reverend Charles Pembury first noticed it during Sunday service at St. Martin's in the Fields. He was midway through his sermon when he realized the congregation was not entirely with him. They were there in body, but not in spirit. Their heads nodded not in agreement but from exhaustion. Some smiled faintly at nothing at all. The Reverend's throat caught in the sweetness that seemed to rise from the crowd like incense. It was not the smell of lilies or of candle wax, it was something colder, sweeter, wrong. After the service, he approached one of his parishioners, Mrs. Lydia Hartwell, a widow known for her devotion. Her veil was heavy, her voice slow. "I find your sermons most comforting, Reverend," she said. "They help me breathe again." He noticed the faint shimmer in her pupils, the trembling of her gloved fingers. When she turned to leave, a lace handkerchief slipped from her pocket. It was damp, and the scent that rose from it made his head spin. By that evening, he had received 3 more confessions, each stranger than the last. One woman wept as she admitted she could not pray without her healing vapor. A young man confessed that he heard angels when he inhaled. Another said she felt nearer to God in the moments just before fainting. The Reverend tried to reassure them, but their trembling calm unnerved him more than any sin he had ever heard. They were not repentant, they were grateful. He began to visit his parishioners at home, hoping to confront the sickness, quietly. What he found were houses that reeked of holiness, gone sour. Rooms where the curtains were always drawn, where small bottles gleamed on mantels beside family Bibles. The widows called it the Lord's comfort. The men called it a mercy for the nerves. Each home smelled faintly of the same invisible sacrament, the city's new religion, breathed in silence and worshipped without altar. One night, as rain lashed against the vicarage windows, Reverend Pembury decided to test his enemy. He poured a few drops of ether onto a cloth, held it to his nose, and prayed. The first breath filled him with warmth, the second with weightlessness, the third with terror. He saw the stained glass of his church illuminated from within, not by sunlight, but by something pale and cold that pulsed like a heartbeat. He dropped the cloth and fell to his knees. When morning came, he delivered his sermon with a trembling voice. "We have mistaken numbness for grace," he told his parish. "We have turned pain itself into a false god." But his words fell upon half-closed eyes, upon lips curved in tranquil smiles. Outside, the church bells tolled through the fog, ringing for a city too drowsy to hear them. And as the parish filed out into the grey morning, the Reverend realized the truth. London was not losing its faith, it was simply inhaling it. In the winter of 1858, the Harcourt home, once bright with music and polished laughter, had grown as still as a mausoleum. The servants moved quietly through its corridors, whispering to one another as though afraid to disturb something sacred or fragile. The curtains never opened now. The air inside hung heavy with dust and that lingering sweetness that could not be banished, no matter how many times the maids threw open the windows. Lady Amelia Harcourt no longer attended parties. She no longer played the pianoforte, or walked in the gardens, or read from her favorite novels. Her days blurred into a hush of pale mornings and sleepless nights. The ether had turned from indulgence to necessity, a ritual she both dreaded and craved. Each morning she promised herself she would stop. Each afternoon, when the tremors began, she found herself reaching again for the decanter that sat upon her dressing table, her most beautiful possession, a crystal vessel shaped like a tear. Her husband, Lord Harcourt, still dined out. He told himself it was to preserve appearances, though in truth he could not bear the silence that clung to the house. When he returned late at night, the hall smelled faintly of lilac and iron, and his wife's door was always locked. Once he knocked. There was no answer. only the muffled sound of glass rolling across a table. He walked away. The final evening came quietly, almost mercifully. A storm swept over London, and the rain tapped against the windows like the ticking of an impatient clock. Lady Amelia sat at her vanity, her hair unpinned, the decanter before her half full. The lamps cast a dim, amber glow across her face. Her reflection in the mirror looked like someone she had once known, a friend now too distant to reach. When the first dose failed to calm her, she poured more, her hands shaking so violently that the glass slipped from her grasp. It shattered against the marble floor, the scent of ether exploding into the room, like a ghost freed from captivity. The cold vapor coiled upward, visible in the lamplight, turning her chamber into a swirling fog. She tried to stand, calling for her maid, but her voice broke into a laugh, high, strange, echoing. By the time the maid arrived, the windows had frosted over. Lady Amelia lay beside the broken glass, her eyes open, her lips curved into the faintest smile. The scent was unbearable, cloying, endless. The maid fled screaming into the corridor. The coroner's report called it an accident. The newspapers offered sympathy for a lady afflicted with delicate health. The death certificate bore no mention of ether, but those who attended the funeral noticed that the lilies placed upon her coffin carried the same faint sweetness that had haunted her house. Even the grave diggers remarked that the air seemed perfumed as they covered the casket. That night, Lord Harcourt sat alone in his study, staring at the last intact crystal glass from the set they had purchased in happier days. He poured himself a drink and inhaled deeply. The scent of the sherry mingled with something sharper that had long lingered on his cuffs. He thought he saw her reflection move across the glass for a moment, smiling faintly, as she always had, just before she vanished. And outside, the storm rolled on, washing the scent of ether into the gutters, down through the drains, where it joined the rest of London's poisons, sweet, invisible, and eternal. By 1859, the man who had once been a quiet apothecary on Regent Street was spoken of in hushed tones among London's elite. They called him the ether merchant. Not to his face, of course. His true name, Alaric Finch, was known only to the desperate and the discreet. To them, he was a savior. To the rest of the city, he was an invisible accomplice to its most fashionable sin. Finch's business had changed. The little glass shop with its polite bell and polished counters was gone. In its place, 2 warehouses on the south side of the Thames hummed day and night, staffed by apprentices who never asked questions and rarely stayed long. The bottles no longer bore his name. They travelled under aliases, packed among shipments of perfume, medical tonics, and imported wine. Some went to Mayfair drawing rooms, others to hospitals, some even to the private retreats of the clergy. Wherever the craving reached, Finch's vapor followed. He told himself it was progress commerce, not corruption. Hadn't Britain built empires on more dangerous trades? Had it not filled its coffers with sugar, gin, and opium? Ether, by comparison, was refined, civilized, and silent. His clients never staggered in the streets. They simply vanished behind curtains. That, he reasoned, was not vice, but discretion. Yet the guilt grew heavier each winter. The city was changing faster than he could bear. He saw it in the faces of his customers, their skin drawn tight, their eyes unfocused, their smiles rehearsed. When he passed the opera house, he could smell his own handiwork in the air, that faint sweetness rising from the crowd like prayer. The scent made him dizzy. Once, it had meant wealth. Now, it only reminded him of the dead. One evening, as he was closing the ledger for the month, a messenger arrived carrying a letter sealed in black wax. Inside was a note, unsigned. Your bottles have killed 3 in Cavendish Square, another in Belgravia. Stop while you still can. Beneath the words was a single pressed violet, brittle and scentless. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked to the warehouse at dawn, past rows of crates waiting to be shipped. The air was so thick with ether that every breath felt like a confession. He stood there for a long time, Listening to the soft clink of glass in the fog, he realized that the vapor had become his shadow. It followed him everywhere, filling his lungs, seeping into his dreams. When the apprentices arrived, they found their employer seated on a crate by the window, a half-finished bottle in his hand. "We'll close for a week," he said without looking up. "No deliveries, no sales." They obeyed, though the orders resumed a month later, as he always knew they would. London could not go a week without its miracle, and Finch, for all his guilt, could not go a day without his profit, or his own nightly breath of oblivion. By the end of the year, his wealth had doubled, but he no longer counted it. He spent his evenings by the river instead, watching the barges vanish into the mist, the water shining faintly with reflected gaslight. The city looked beautiful from there, soft, distant, blurred, as if seen through a veil of vapor. He wondered if this was what his customers saw before the end. London dissolving into sweetness, the world fading not from decay, but from the soft mercy of forgetting. In the spring of 1860, London awaited the return of its prodigy. Eleanor Ravenscroft had not played in public for nearly a year, her absence explained by ill health in polite circles and by darker whispers elsewhere. The theatres printed her name in gold ink. The papers called her the Hands of England. Her talent was legendary, so was her frailty. When she finally stepped onto the stage of St. James's Hall that April evening, the audience rose before she played a single note. The gas lamps shimmered on her pale silk gown. She bowed graceful, ethereal, almost translucent, and seated herself at the grand piano. For a moment, silence filled the hall, heavy with anticipation. Then she raised her hands, slender and ungloved, and struck the first chord. It rang clear as a bell. The audience exhaled as one. But then came the second note, and her right hand faltered just slightly, a tremor, delicate as a breath. Most thought it emotion. A few, who knew her better, recognized the truth. She had taken ether again. Behind the curtain before the performance, her maid had seen it. The small silver vial, the handkerchief folded with ritual care. "Only a breath," Eleanor had whispered, "just enough to steady me." She had promised herself that after tonight she would stop, but the world demanded perfection, and perfection demanded oblivion. As she played, her fingers began to shimmer against the keys. To the audience, it looked like magic the way her hands seemed to hover, their motion too fast, too fluid. The melody poured out with feverish beauty, alternating between tenderness and violence. Some swore they saw tears on her cheeks, though her expression never changed. Halfway through the nocturne, the tremor worsened. Her wrists quivered, her shoulders stiffened. The notes blurred, clashing softly like falling glass. She tried to breathe, but the air seemed thick, too sweet. For a moment she thought she heard applause already, the sound swelling, distant, eternal. Her vision shimmered white. When the final chord came, she froze in place. Silence fell again, longer this time, uncertain. The audience waited for her to rise, to bow, to smile. She did none of those things. The hall erupted into applause anyway, thunderous and unrelenting. It wasn't until her maid rushed to her side that anyone saw her eyes rolled back, her hands still poised mid-air, trembling faintly over the ivory keys. The papers called it a faint. The doctors called it exhaustion. But those who carried her from the stage whispered that her lips smelled faintly floral, like crushed violets and frost. She recovered, at least enough to stand before the public again a month later. But the tremor never left her. Each performance grew shorter, each applause more brittle. Eventually, she withdrew from the stage entirely, vanishing into a house on the outskirts of Kensington where the windows were always closed. There, in the dim rooms filled with silence, she kept a single piano. The keys had turned yellow with time, and a small bottle gleamed always at her side. Sometimes the servants heard faint music drifting through the door, melodies too slow, too sad, too perfect to be of this world. They said, her hands still moved in sleep, They said the tremor never stopped, even after the music finally did. By 1861, London had learned to speak of death with elegance. Mourning was an art form: jet beads, black lace, and hushed voices in candlelit parlors, but for some, grief had become a kind of experiment. Among them was Mrs. Isabel Fenwick, a widow of 40 who lived alone in a grand house on Fitzroy Square. Her husband, a chemist, had died 3 years earlier after a laboratory fire that filled the street with a bitter, unfamiliar scent. The neighbors said the smell lingered for weeks. Isabel never left the house afterward. In her husband's absence, she found comfort in his notebooks. The equations, the formulas, the scrawled notes about distillation and vapor pressure, all of it became her prayer book. The servants often heard her at night, pacing the laboratory he had left behind, the blue flames of the gas burners flickering against the windows like ghostly candles. When questioned, she would only smile and say she was continuing his work. No one knew what that work had truly been until she began ordering supplies: glass retorts, tubing, chemicals by the crate. Deliveries arrived under false names, though every chemist in London recognized the request for what it was: ether, gallons of it, pure and unadulterated. At first, her neighbors assumed she was mad with grief. Then came the rumors that she had begun to see her husband again, not in dreams, but in vapor. The maids whispered that she spoke to him through the fumes, her voice low and tender, as if conversing with someone just out of sight. Once, a footman swore he heard 2 sets of footsteps echoing through the house, though she lived alone. Her experiments became more elaborate. She built a glass chamber in the center of the laboratory, large enough for a person to sit inside. The walls were lined with mirrors so that light fractured endlessly, reflecting 1,000 versions of her face. Each night she entered, sealing the door behind her. Within minutes the air would fog, glowing softly from the lamp she carried. Sometimes she emerged weeping, sometimes laughing, sometimes utterly still. She called it communion. In a letter discovered years later, she wrote, "He comes to me in the mist. I feel his breath upon mine. We are joined again, beyond flesh, beyond sound. The ether makes the veil so thin I can almost reach through it." One night, the neighbors heard an explosion that shook the glass of every house on the square. When the constable forced the door open, they found the laboratory in ruins, every mirror shattered. In the center of the floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled chemicals, lay Isabel Fenwick. She was smiling faintly, her eyes open, her skin untouched by flame. The scent that filled the air was not of smoke or fire, but of something achingly sweet: flowers, rain, and decay all at once. The newspapers called it a scientific accident. But those who passed the house in the following weeks swore the windows still glowed faintly at night, and that when the wind blew from Fitzroy Square, you could smell a trace of her experiment in the air, proof, perhaps, that the widow had succeeded, and that her vaporous heaven had finally found her. By 1862, the haze that hung over London's upper circles had begun to take form not as disease or vice, but as philosophy. The doctors whispered of ether addiction, but its adherents called it transcendence. Out of the salons of Mayfair and the drawing rooms of Bloomsbury arose a quiet fellowship that named itself the Society of Breath. Its members were writers, physicians, painters, and widows, men and women who had long since confused enlightenment with anesthesia. They met not in taverns or clubs, but in private homes, always after midnight, when the city was asleep, and the fog outside made it seem as though the world had already dissolved. Their gatherings followed a ritual of unnerving elegance. Each guest arrived dressed in white, symbolizing purity of mind. At the center of the room stood a great glass globe, suspended by iron hooks and filled with vapor that shimmered blue in the candlelight. They would sit in a circle, their gloved hands joined, and breathe in unison as one of them read from their Book of Clarity, a leather-bound volume of quotations and half-delirious revelations written by the Society's founder, Dr. Horace Lay. Lay had once been a surgeon, a colleague of Dr. Elwood's, but had left medicine after declaring that pain was a superstition of the unawakened. He claimed that ether revealed the true world, one without suffering, one in which the body dissolved into light. His followers believed him utterly. They practiced sacred inhalation, claiming to glimpse eternity in the rising vapors. One aristocrat's diary entry, later found after her death, read, "I saw myself multiplied 1,000 times in the glass. Each breath was a prayer, each exhale resurrection." At first, they met weekly, then nightly. Members began to abandon their professions, their marriages, even their children. The society grew to dozens, then hundreds. They printed pamphlets, beautifully bound, discreetly, distributed, arguing that ether was the breath of divinity, the undoing of mortal sin. Servants who attended their gatherings described scenes of eerie stillness. Guests seated in trance-like composure, their faces serene, their eyes fixed on nothing. No one spoke above a whisper. Inevitably, someone died. The first was a young woman named Miss Eliza Rowe, who failed to wake from her meditation. Her fellow members called it an ascension, not a death. They buried her in white, without priest or psalm, and continued their meetings unabated. When a second member perished the same way, Dr. Lay declared that the faintness was proof of success. "We are nearing perfection," he told them. The scandal broke only when a housemaid fled one of their ceremonies and told the constable that the room reeked of sweetness and angels. The newspapers feasted on it. "Cult of Death in Mayfair," the headlines screamed. Dr. Lay vanished before he could be questioned. The remaining members swore their innocence, insisting that their worship was merely the pursuit of peace. But within months, the fog over the Thames grew thicker, and those who walked near the river at night claimed to see pale shapes drifting through the mist, white-clad figures breathing in rhythm, their faces turned toward heaven. The Society of Breath had been disbanded on paper, yet London itself, that sleepless congregation, continued their ritual faithfully. Every night, as the vapor rose from chimney and candle, the city exhaled as one each soul, believing that with the next breath it might finally forget it was alive. The first explosion came just before dawn on the 23rd of January, 1863. At first, those who heard it thought it thunder, winter thunder, strange but not impossible. But then came the second, sharper and closer, and the glass in nearby windows shuddered in their frames. Within moments, a bloom of orange rose over Hanover Street, illuminating the fog like dawn arriving too soon. London had seen fire before, but this one was different. This one glowed white-blue, too clean, too bright, burning not wood or oil, but something far more volatile. At number 34, Hanover Street, stood the workshop of Finch and Company, a discreet pharmaceutical supplier that most of its neighbors mistook for a perfumery. In truth, it was one of the city's largest clandestine ether refineries. Finch himself had withdrawn from the operation months before, leaving the business in the hands of younger, greedier men. They had expanded production, careless of safety, storing barrels in the cellar, the attic, even the hallways. The air inside had long since become a living bomb. The night watchman saw the flame first, a faint flicker beneath the door of the distillation room. He barely had time to shout before the entire front of the building erupted outward, showering the street with shards of glass and molten metal. The fire climbed fast, licking at the windows, devouring the timbers in waves of pale light. Witnesses said it did not burn red like ordinary flame, but blue-white, like the heart of lightning. It made no sound at first, only a deep humming, as though the air itself were trying to breathe. Residents poured from their houses in nightclothes. Some stood frozen, mesmerized by the strange beauty of the blaze. Others rushed forward with buckets, only to stagger back choking as the fumes hit them, a sweetness so overpowering it made their eyes water and their lungs seize. A constable tried to push through the smoke and collapsed within seconds, his face slack, as if asleep. By morning, the street was gone. What remained of the building was a blackened shell, its bricks glistening faintly under a thin layer of frost. The newspapers declared it the Hanover catastrophe. printing lurid illustrations of women fainting in the streets and children carried from the wreckage. Only a few lines mentioned that the air had smelled oddly pleasant. The official inquiry blamed faulty lamps, though every chemist in London knew better. Ether was whispering its danger now, claiming its first public spectacle. But no one wanted the truth. The surviving partners of Finch and Company were quietly compensated. The city moved on. Hanover Street was rebuilt within the year. Still, those who lived nearby said the sweetness never left. On damp nights, they swore they could still smell it rising from the cobblestones, a faint perfume like lilacs and lightning. Some claimed to see blue fire flicker along the gutters when the fog grew thick, though no lamp burned nearby. For the first time, the city glimpsed what it had become, a vast tinderbox, soaked not in oil or gin, but in dreams. And though Hanover Street lay in ashes, the scent of its ruin drifted on the wind, finding new rooms, new lungs, new worshippers to burn. The morning after the fire, London awoke beneath a sky the colour of pewter. The fog had rolled in early, mingling with the residue of smoke, carrying the faint sweetness of ether across the city, like a ghost determined to be remembered. Before the bells of Street Martins had finished their first toll, the papers were already on the streets. Newsboys shouted through the chill. "Explosion in Hanover Street, dozens dead, mysterious vapour fills the air." But few of those who bought the broadsheets would read past the first paragraph. They didn't need to. The headlines were enough to feed the curiosity and bury the truth. Inside the print rooms, the editors debated what should be said. The explosion had frightened too many important men. Investors, chemists, even parliamentarians had stakes in the refinement and trade of ether. It was too lucrative, too respectable, to be condemned outright. So the Morning Chronicle called it an unfortunate accident in an establishment of scientific value. The Illustrated London News described a mismanagement of spirituous material, careful never to name the substance, and the Times, ever the voice of authority, blamed careless heating in an apothecary's laboratory before concluding that no moral blame can be assigned. Yet among the readers, especially the women who had fainted behind silk fans, and the men who kept their own vials in the drawers of their desks, something trembled. The illustration that accompanied the article showed the building as a cathedral of smoke, its windows gaping like eyes. Beneath it, a line read, "The flames burned blue and clean as heaven." It was meant as poetry, but it struck closer to prophecy. Dr. Elwood, who had long since ceased to practice, read the news from his rented room in Chelsea. His hands, once steady as instruments, shook so badly he could scarcely hold the paper. The account described barrels bursting, bodies found unmarked, their faces serene, their lungs full of vapor. It sounded like sleep, like the very peace he had promised his patients and stolen for himself. He folded the newspaper neatly, set it aside, and poured the contents of his latest bottle into the wash basin. It hissed as it met the air. The scent rose and did not fade. In the clubs of Pall Mall, men discussed the fire with the detached amusement of those insulated by wealth. They toasted progress and condemned reckless chemistry, but as the hours passed, the talk turned to investments. "Once the panic settles," one man said, "the demand will double." He was right. That afternoon, orders for refined ether reached their highest volume yet. Only the lower classes seemed to understand the horror. The charwomen who scrubbed the blackened stones whispered of judgment, saying the fire had been divine punishment for the city's false holiness. Some claimed they could hear crying in the smoke. Others said the blue flames had spelled words in the air warnings too terrible to repeat. But by nightfall, the presses had already moved on. The second edition of the Times carried no mention of ether at all. Hanover Street was reduced to a column's worth of ash. And the next morning, the same readers who had shivered over the story opened their papers again, only to find advertisements for soothing aromatic vapors for the relief of nerves and melancholy printed just opposite the obituaries. London's conscience was brief. The ink had dried by noon, and the city inhaled again, each breath erasing the memory of fire. each sigh carrying the faint perfume of its own undoing. By the spring of 1864, London's fascination with ether had finally acquired a courtroom. The scandal that began in whispers among the sick rooms of Mayfair and the salons of Bloomsbury had at last grown too large to hide. Dr. James Elwood, once the city's most celebrated surgeon, now a recluse with trembling hands, was summoned to stand before the Royal College of Physicians, accused not of murder, but of gross professional misconduct and moral negligence in the use of experimental vapors. It was the closest thing to justice the city could bear. The proceedings were held in the old lecture theatre at Gresham Hall, its benches packed with doctors, reporters, and society spectators dressed in sombre finery. Outside, the air was damp and sour with fog, but inside it smelled faintly of starch, ink, and fear. A single gas lamp hissed above the bench, throwing Elwood's face into shadow as he rose to speak. He looked older than anyone expected. His once black hair had turned white at the temples, his eyes hollowed by sleeplessness. Yet there was still a precision in his movements, a ghost of the man who had once guided a scalpel through living flesh without hesitation. The prosecution read the charges that Dr. Elwood had administered ether to patients without due caution, that he had distributed it to private clients for unlicensed recreation, that he had continued to use and supply it even after the Hanover Street fire and the deaths of several prominent women under his care. Each accusation landed softly in the murmuring crowd like drops of rain before a storm. When invited to respond, Elwood spoke with a quietness that forced everyone to lean forward. "I gave them peace," he said simply. "You call it misconduct. I call it mercy." Gasps rippled through the room. The prosecutor pressed him. "You deny that you endangered them?" "I did not endanger them," he replied. "They were already dying of pain, of vanity, of the great leaf, century itself. Ether was not their poison, it was their prayer." At that, someone in the gallery laughed, a high, nervous sound quickly silenced. The judges conferred among themselves. They asked about the missing records, the unpaid debts, the women who had died in their homes. Elwood listened, head bowed, hands clasped behind his back. When shown the bottle recovered from Lady Harcourt's dressing table, his prescription written clearly on the label, he did not look away. "I taught London how to forget pain," he said at last. "You wanted progress, and I gave it to you. But you mistook numbness for virtue. Do not ask me to carry the weight of that alone." There was no applause, only the soft rustle of papers and the scratching of pens. The verdict came quickly. Elwood was to be stripped of his license, barred from practice, and placed under medical supervision. The sentence was merciful, too merciful, some said, but the damage was done. That evening, as the court emptied, a reporter approached him on the steps. "Do you have any statement for the public, sir?" Elwood looked out over the fog-thick street, where the gas lamps flickered like dying stars. "Only this," he murmured. "You cannot put a man on trial for giving the city what it begged for." He turned, walked into the mist, and was never seen again. Weeks later, a new pamphlet appeared anonymously on the city's bookstalls, "The Ethics of Anesthesia, by One Who Knows." Inside, readers found a single line scrawled across the title page: "Pain is memory. Ether is oblivion. Which, then, do you prefer?" It sold out within the week. The scandal surrounding Lady Amelia Harcourt refused to die. Even after the inquest, after the papers had printed their polite lies and the servants had been dismissed in silence, her name continued to linger in drawing rooms like a ghost. She was spoken of in murmurs, often accompanied by that faint whiff of lilac perfume, the same scent that had once filled her chamber the night she died. By 1865, she had become less a person than a symbol, her story retold in fragments. The perfect wife, undone by invisible indulgence, the martyr of her own refinement. Her widower, Lord Thomas Harcourt, withdrew from society. At first, his seclusion was attributed to grief. Later, to guilt. He attended no dinners, gave no speeches in Parliament, refused invitations to every ball and fete. The mansion on Brook Street stood shuttered, its windows veiled, the marble steps gathering soot. When a neighbor remarked that no flowers had been placed at the door since the funeral, a footman quietly replied that the master could not bear the smell. Inside, the house was a tomb. Amelia's dressing table remained untouched, the mirror draped in lace, the silver brush still holding a single strand of her hair. On the table sat a single unbroken glass decanter, stoppered and full. He could not bring himself to open it. Yet sometimes, late at night, he would go to the room, stand in the doorway, and imagine her still there, pale, graceful, smiling faintly, asking if he would like her to play the pianoforte. He would whisper yes, and the silence that followed was almost worse than memory. The servants stayed as long as they could bear it. They spoke of footsteps in the corridors, of the faint click of a lock turning from within, of whispers that came from the empty nursery at dusk. When they left, they said the air of the house was not like other air, that it clung to the lungs, that it carried sweetness and sorrow in equal measure. Lord Harcourt's decline was slow. He began to drink more, sleep less, and avoid his few remaining friends. When one of them called, months later, to check on him, he was found sitting in Amelia's chair beside the decanter, his eyes half closed. The friend noticed the smell at once, the same floral chill that had haunted the city's scandals for years. The doctor declared it apoplexy. The coroner, who had seen enough of such cases to know better, wrote heart failure. But the footman who discovered him whispered that there had been a small glass cup on the table beside his hand, and that the stopper of the decanter was gone. In the end, London found poetry in their tragedy. The newspapers called them the perfect pair reunited at last. Songs were written, plays performed, their story softened into something tender and moral. No one mentioned ether. No one mentioned that the same sweetness still drifted faintly from the Harcourt house long after both its owners were gone. Sometimes, when the fog grew heavy in Brook Street, the lamplighters swore they could see two figures through the upper window, a man and a woman, seated close together, their heads bowed, as if listening for music that only they could hear. And when the wind shifted, it carried with it that same impossible scent, the perfume of love, of death, and of forgetting. By the autumn of 1866, the government could no longer pretend that ether belonged only to the private realm of medicine and manners. The fire at Hanover Street, the trial of Dr. Elwood, and the death of Lady Harcourt had woven a pattern too vivid to ignore. The whispers had reached Westminster, where the corridors of Parliament reeked of cigar smoke, damp wool, and, to the more observant, that faint, floral trace that seemed to follow every man of influence. It was the Under-Secretary for Health, Sir William Pennington, who first demanded an inquiry. He was a proud man, a veteran of public order committees, known for his booming voice and his tendency to mistake outrage for virtue. His speeches were long and theatrical, and though few listened, all applauded. He declared that London must cleanse itself of its chemical plague, that ether was a poison disguised as perfume, and that the moral health of the empire itself was at stake. He was applauded again more loudly this time, though most of the men clapping had small bottles of the same poison hidden in their coat pockets. The debate became spectacle. Journalists filled the gallery, sketching caricatures of pale-faced ministers, arguing in clouds of vapor from their own scented handkerchiefs. Outside, protesters gathered, some calling for restriction, others demanding that ether remain unregulated, claiming it to be a gift of divine science. The chemists defended their trade, the doctors defended their discoveries, and the aristocracy, terrified of exposure, defended their silence. But the truth was that Parliament itself was compromised. Late in the evening, after the debates ended, the same men who had thundered about morality retired to private chambers where small glass decanters gleamed beside the port. There, they inhaled the very substance they condemned, each promising himself it would be the last time. They called it a nightcap for the nerves. Sir William discovered this hypocrisy in the most humiliating way. One night, after leaving the chamber, He stumbled upon his own superior. The Home Secretary collapsed in his office, eyes rolled back, a damp handkerchief pressed to his mouth. The room smelled sweet and metallic. For a moment, Sir William thought he was witnessing a death, but the man stirred, blinked, and smiled lazily. "You see, my dear Pennington," he murmured, "the vapor gives one courage for the next debate." Something in Sir William cracked. The following morning, he burst into session demanding immediate prohibition, waving the Morning Chronicle above his head like a holy book. "If we will not act," he shouted, "we are complicit in the slow death of our own people." But as he spoke, his hands began to tremble. His voice faltered. Sweat glistened on his forehead. He swayed, clutching at the podium. Someone rushed forward, thinking he was ill, but the truth came too late. His coat pocket held a half-empty vial. He was carried out as the chamber fell into uneasy silence. The motion to regulate ether failed by a narrow vote. The papers the next day described a sudden seizure brought on by fatigue. Privately, the ministers laughed, toasted his recovery, and drew their curtains tighter that night. And so, the government's war against ether ended before it began, defeated not by protest or science, but by the scent already lingering on every tongue that spoke against it. London had learned to live with its sickness. Parliament had merely joined the congregation. By the winter of 1867, Parliament's failure to act had been taken as a declaration of permission. The chemists, long operating in secrecy, emerged from their back rooms and basements into the open. Across London, new shops appeared overnight, brightly painted, well lit, their windows displaying gleaming bottles and ornate signage, promising aromatic restoratives, spirit of serenity, and medicinal vapors for gentle constitutions. They called it progress. The newspapers called it innovation. The doctors, who knew better, called it surrender. The Chemists' Guild, once a modest trade association of respectable apothecaries, now declared itself an industry of freedom. At its head stood Tobias Venn, a thin, fox-faced man whose charm could dissolve any moral argument like sugar in hot tea. He was neither doctor nor scientist, but he understood commerce better than any physician alive. Venn travelled the city in a polished carriage emblazoned with a silver flame, giving speeches about the democratization of comfort. He spoke to crowds of clerks and factory women, declaring that ether was the people's remedy, a right rather than a luxury. The strategy worked. By Christmas, the working-class districts of Whitechapel and Lambeth, once untouched by the habits of Mayfair, were clouded with the same invisible sweetness. The poor could now buy their dreams in half-penny doses. Small children ran errands for their parents, returning home with tiny bottles wrapped in brown paper. Shopkeepers kept vials behind the counter beside the tobacco and lamp oil, and when the constables tried to confiscate the stock, crowds jeered and pelted them with stones. The chemists met the government's condemnation with elegant defiance. "You cannot outlaw relief," Venn told the Illustrated London News. "Pain is universal, so too must be its remedy." When one inspector accused him of selling poison, he simply smiled and handed the man a dampened cloth. "See for yourself," he said. The inspector later resigned without explanation. Behind the facade of respectability, however, the industry had turned monstrous. Factories sprang up along the riverbanks, venting pale smoke into the air that shimmered faintly blue in the morning light. Children worked the stills, women polished the bottles until their fingers cracked. Fires broke out frequently, but no one dared to shut the places down. The profit was too great. Ether had become London's newest export, its newest addiction. Dr. Horace Lay, the vanished prophet of the Society of Breath, reappeared briefly, offering to consult for Venn's company. His writings were reprinted and distributed as pamphlets to promote sales. "Let every man breathe as he wills," he wrote. "The future belongs to those who conquer sensation." The phrase became the Guild's motto. By the year's end, the Thames ran thick with residue from the refineries, carrying its shimmer out to sea. Fishermen claimed that on still nights, when the tide was low, the water exhaled softly, as though the river itself were sighing in its sleep. And in the city above, London continued to hum with quiet intoxication. Every class, every street, every window breathed the same faint perfume. The rebellion had succeeded, not through protest or violence, but through commerce. The city no longer feared its addiction. It had found a way to monetize it. Even the churches smelled of ether now, though no one dared to speak of it. They simply called it incense, and bowed their heads as the vapor rose, believing perhaps that heaven, too, had learned to sell its miracles by the bottle. By 1868, the children of London had begun to imitate their elders. They did not understand the sickness that wrapped around the city like a fog, only that the grown-ups moved slower now, spoke softer, and slept in the middle of the day. In kitchens and attics, they learned to mimic what they saw, to copy the gestures of comfort that filled their homes with sweetness and silence. In the Harrow Road tenements, where the scent of ether had trickled down through every cracked wall and open window, a girl named Bess Harding watched her mother every morning. The ritual never changed. At dawn, before the fire was lit, her mother would sit beside the window, her hands trembling as she pressed a folded rag to her lips. The air would turn faintly blue, the smell like flowers and rust. Afterward, she would hum to herself, a lullaby without words. Bess tried it once when her mother wasn't looking. She found the small bottle on the mantel and uncorked it. The cold sting of the vapor caught her breath. The world tilted, and the sound of the street outside grew far away. For a moment she felt light, almost happy. Then her knees buckled, and she woke to her mother's screaming. That night, the bottle was locked away but not thrown out. No one ever threw them out. Across the river in Southwark, factory children carried smaller bottles for their parents, nerve tonics, household restoratives. They learned which chemists would sell without asking, which would slip an extra vial into the parcel if you smiled. Boys ran errands for shillings, then kept a drop or two for themselves. One of them, a chimney sweep named Tom Keene, began boasting to his friends that he could fly without wings. He would lie on the roof tiles after dark, breathing the vapor through a handkerchief until he giggled himself into unconsciousness. The others followed. By the week's end, one boy had fallen 3 stories and broken his neck. The others swore they heard him, laughing as he fell. The newspapers printed none of it. Ether was still a gentleman's vice, a lady's indulgence, too elegant to share its name with the slums. But the fog did not care about class. It drifted through every alley, every orphanage, every school. Teachers began to notice the strange behavior of their pupils, drowsiness, headaches, fits of laughter during prayer. When one headmistress sent a sample of the air in her classroom to a chemist, the reply came back quietly. High concentration of diethyl vapor. Source unknown. The source, of course, was everywhere. From the factories, from the parlors, from the cracks of every window that opened to the London air. By winter, the city's children had begun to play a new game. They called it the Sleepy Angel. One would hold a handkerchief to another's face while the others sang softly, counting until the player went limp. Then they would laugh and swap places. Parents heard the giggling through the walls and thought it only a game. But those who walked the streets at dawn, when the fog lay heaviest, told a different story. They said you could see small shapes moving through it, barefoot figures vanishing around corners, their breath rising pale and sweet in the cold. London had infected its children, and they were learning early what the grown-ups already knew, that forgetting, once tasted, could feel like flight. By the summer of 1869, London seemed to flower with sickness. The fog itself had taken on a strange brightness, a pale, opalescent sheen that shimmered under the gas lamps. Visitors from the provinces remarked upon the beauty of the city's nights, how the air glowed faintly above the streets, how the shop fronts seemed to float in a silver haze. But to those who lived within it, there was something unsettling in that glow. It was not light, it was residue. The city was breathing its addiction. In Kensington, the flower markets were thriving. Florists began to notice that their bouquets lasted longer indoors than they once had. The lilies and lilacs remained fresh for days, sometimes weeks, their petals slick with a thin, oily dew. The chemists, amused, claimed it was a miracle of atmosphere, the ether in the air preserving the flowers like embalming fluid, but the same bloom that spared the lilies from decay had begun to eat at the people. Women who spent their days indoors developed a faint translucence to their skin. Men grew pale and thin, their veins showing blue beneath the surface, like fine cracks in porcelain. The doctors named it vapor fatigue. They prescribed clean air, country retreats, travel to the seaside, but the wealthy refused to leave the city. They called the air of London invigorating, addictive. They said it made them dream more vividly. On the streets, everything moved slower. Carriages rolled through fog so thick that drivers lit lanterns on their horses' bridles. Street sweepers covered their mouths with scarves. The Thames glistened with a milky shimmer where waste from the refineries bled into the water. On some mornings, the river appeared to be steaming. The children's game, the Sleepy Angel, spread like contagion. Clergymen preached against it. Pamphlets warned parents of chemical play. Yet in the alleyways, the sound of soft singing continued, the tune now known to every child from Whitechapel to Westminster. When the constables tried to confiscate their makeshift bottles, the children only laughed, calling them dream catchers. Even nature seemed to have adapted. The trees along Regent's Park exhaled a faint perfume that made passers-by dizzy. At dusk, moths clustered in thick clouds around the lamps, their wings glinting faintly blue. Cats moved more slowly, dogs barked less. Everything that breathed had become drowsy, docile, and half-enchanted. Writers called it the bloom. Poets compared it to Eden before the fall London as a garden of gentle intoxication. One wrote, "The city smells of paradise, and we its dreaming Adam." Yet those who lived near the river began to bury their dead more often. The undertakers noticed that the bodies no longer stiffened properly, as though even death had become languid. Dr. Tobias Venn, the Ether Guild's self-proclaimed visionary, gave a speech to a crowd outside the Royal Exchange. "We have achieved harmony," he declared. "The city and its citizens breathe as one." The crowd applauded wildly. That night, the wind shifted from the sea, and for a brief moment, the fog lifted. Those awake at that hour claimed to have seen the city clearly for the first time in years. The buildings stood pale and skeletal, the streets glistening as if varnished. The air smelled of flowers and corrosion. Then the wind stilled, and the fog returned, soft and sweet, curling through the windows like a lover come home. London bloomed on, luminous and rotting, a vast garden of breath where beauty and decay had finally become indistinguishable. By 1870, the widow of Julian Corbyn emerged from the shadows that grief had long held her in. For nearly a decade she had lived quietly in Hampstead, a recluse among her dead husband's canvases, each one sealed in linen and dust. She had refused to sell them after his death, refused to let the galleries have their spectacle. Yet time, like ether, dissolves resistance. When an art dealer came calling with promises of a retrospective of genius, she agreed to meet him. That was how she found herself, one grey morning, descending the cellar stairs to confront her husband's ghosts. The smell hit her first. Not dust, not mildew, but sweetness. The faint metallic perfume that had clung to Julian's studio in the final years of his madness. The air was still heavy with it, as if he had only just left the room. The canvases leaned against the walls in silent ranks, the cloths that covered them yellowed with time. She hesitated, then pulled one free. The painting beneath was still alive. The colors had not faded, they shimmered faintly, as though lit from behind. The subject was a woman herself, though younger, brighter, her eyes wide with awe. She remembered the sitting, the way Julian had breathed deeply before every stroke, the scent filling the room until she grew light-headed. He had told her that ether clarified the soul. Now, staring at her own painted face, she saw the lie. The pupils were too large, the skin too luminous, the smile too fixed. It was not a portrait of a woman, but of a trance. She uncovered more. Each canvas carried the same strange vitality, figures half-formed, eyes gleaming, edges blurred as if the world had melted slightly around them. One painting, perhaps his last, showed a man seated before an easel, surrounded by vapor that twisted into faces. His own face was indistinct, dissolving into the mist. The signature at the bottom was smeared, as though written by a trembling hand. The widow stood for a long time in the purse's foremost, the dim cellar, the gas lamp flickering, the smell growing stronger with every breath. She began to feel dizzy. The colors on the paintings seemed to ripple. A hum filled the air, not sound exactly, but something beneath it, like the vibration of a struck string. She staggered backward, clutching the railing. When the dealer found her later, she was seated before one of the canvases, her expression rapt. "Do you see it?" she whispered. "He's still painting." Word of her discovery spread quickly. The retrospective opened that autumn to tremendous acclaim. Critics called Corbin's work visionary, alive with supernatural grace. Some even claimed the paintings glowed faintly in darkness. Crowds lined up to breathe the same air his widow had preserved. Many left the gallery light-headed, euphoric, unable to describe what they'd seen. The widow attended the opening but did not stay long. When she returned home, she locked the studio and burned what remained of his unfinished sketches. "They are not his," she told the maid. "There's something else pretending to be." Weeks later, the maid noticed the same sweet scent seeping beneath the locked door. She never entered again, but those who walked past the house after midnight swore they saw pale light pulsing behind the shutters, as if someone inside were painting still stroke by slow, steady stroke, breathing the city's poison back into color. By 1871, the quiet countryside outside London no longer promised escape from its vapors. The fog rolled farther each year, following the railways, the carriages, the breath of those who fled the city's glow. Just beyond Highgate, on a rise that had once been a priory garden, stood the newly constructed St. Margaret's Sanatorium for nervous and chemical disorders. It was built of pale stone and high windows, part hospital, part monastery, part prison. The public was told it offered restoration for minds overtaken by the pressures of modernity. Privately, everyone knew it for what it was, the ether asylum. The building's architect had designed it to be flooded with air. Long corridors opened into courtyards, each meant to dilute temptation. Yet the smell was already there before the first patients arrived. It clung to the walls from the start, faint and floral, as though the wind itself carried the city's taint uphill. Dr. Elias Morton was its superintendent, a man of grim compassion. He had studied under Dr. Elwood before the trial, and though he disavowed his mentor's philosophy of mercy, he could not deny the demand for treatment. The admissions book filled faster than the beds could be made. They came from every class: the daughters of Parliament, the wives of tradesmen, the poets, the chemists' apprentices, even a clergyman who claimed he saw God in vapor form. Each morning began with silence. The patients rose at dawn, took their tonics, and were led to the garden to breathe pure air. Yet the purity was never enough. The trembling started after breakfast, hands fluttering, eyelids twitching, whispers of invisible music. By afternoon they wept or laughed without cause. At night they dreamed in unison, calling out to the same invisible comfort they had left behind. The nurses said the sound of their breathing, when heard from the hallway, resembled the tide. Dr. Morton kept meticulous notes. Case 14. Female, 32, claims to smell flowers that are not present. Case 27. Male poet requests ether to steady the verse. He refused every request, but the nurses whispered that someone was still providing it. The symptoms spread from ward to ward. One morning he entered the infirmary and found a mirror fogged, though no one had touched it. "They have found a way," he muttered. "The city reaches even here." Within months, the asylum became a curiosity. Carriages arrived at the gates, bringing society's voyeurs who wanted to glimpse the victims of the vapor age. The director tried to stop them, but the board needed the funding. Tours were permitted. Ladies fainted, Gentlemen took notes. The patients, dressed in white, sat quietly on benches in the sun, eyes unfocused, as if listening to distant music. The asylum's chapel was the only place where silence held. Yet even there, the altar candles burned with a strange blue edge. Dr. Morton noticed it first, then the chaplain, then the nurses. No one spoke of it aloud, but every Sunday the congregation grew smaller, as if one by one they were surrendering to that faint sweetness in the air. By year's end, 20 patients had passed peacefully. The newspapers praised the asylum's success. London's lost souls now rest in comfort, one article read. But those who lived nearby told a different story. They said that on certain nights, when the wind came down from the hill, it carried a low hum and the scent of lilies and iron. Some claimed to see faint lights moving along the corridors, like lanterns swaying in the mist. And if you stood very still, they said, you could hear the sound of breathing, hundreds of soft, synchronized sighs rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the city below. By the spring of 1872, London had grown accustomed to funerals that looked like sleep. The physicians called it apoplexy, fatigue, or sudden faint of the heart, but the undertakers had stopped asking questions. The bodies arrived pale and peaceful, the lips faintly smiling as if they had dreamed themselves away. Among them was one whose name, for a brief moment, shook what little conscience the city had left. Mr. Edmund Bligh, barrister, scholar, and lecturer on moral philosophy, dead at 37, seated upright in his study chair with a law book open before him. His wife had found him early one morning. The candles had burned down to their stubs, and the air in the room was thick with that familiar sweetness. The coroner, when he arrived, immediately recognized it but said nothing. The report would later state natural causes. Yet the whispers that followed told the truth that polite society could not print, that Mr. Bligh, the same man who had spoken in Parliament against the chemical decay of the soul, had been found with a handkerchief still clutched in his hand. Before his death, Edmund Bligh had built a reputation as London's last moral voice. His essays on the virtues of pain and against the numbing of the heart had circulated among the city's intellectual circles. He had written passionately about the need to feel, to suffer, to live without anesthesia. To escape pain, he wrote, is to forfeit meaning. It was the kind of conviction that made him famous and privately tormented. For years, he had watched the people around him dissolve into gentility and forgetfulness, and he despised them for it. But temptation is crueler to the righteous than to the weak. His downfall began quietly. After a severe illness, his doctor prescribed ether in small restorative doses. At first, Bligh refused, quoting scripture about endurance. But when the pain became unbearable, he relented. His first inhalation brought tears to his eyes. It was not the numbness that struck him, but the clarity. The world sharpened, the pain vanished, and for the first time he felt something close to grace. He told himself it was only temporary, a mercy, not indulgence. But the bottle on his desk emptied faster with each passing week. Neighbors began to notice his changed routine. The light in his study burned until morning. His letters became erratic, full of strange metaphors. The air here hums like a cathedral, he wrote to a friend. The silence feels alive. His wife later said she would sometimes wake to find him standing at the window, breathing slowly, his reflection pale against the glass. The night before his death, he had been preparing a new lecture, The Human Duty to Remain Awake. He never finished it. The maid who delivered his tea found him sitting upright, pen still in hand, eyes open but unseeing. The only sound in the room was the faint hiss of vapor escaping from the uncapped vial beside him. London reacted as it always did, with fascination masquerading as grief. The newspapers praised his intellect and his gentle passing. His followers spoke of him as a martyr to contemplation. But those who had stood in that room remembered something else. The unnatural warmth of his skin, the faint shimmer of his pupils, the whisper of air still escaping from the bottle, as though the city itself were exhaling through him. In the weeks that followed, More men of his class followed him quietly into the same sleep. The phrase, "the Bly manner," entered London's slang, meaning to die elegantly, without pain. And thus, even in death, the man who had begged the world to stay awake taught it another way to dream. By 1873, London had grown quieter than anyone could remember. The roar of carts, the hammering of horseshoes, the shouts of vendors all still there, yet softened somehow, as though the city had drawn a long, tired breath and forgotten to let it go. Those who had lived there all their lives said the hush was unnerving. The air itself seemed to absorb sound. Even the bells of street halls carried strangely, their tones dull, their echoes short-lived. The city that had once rattled and roared now murmured. It was not peace, it was exhaustion. The chemists called it progress. The clergy called it judgment. The poets, who had once celebrated the bloom, began to write of decay. And through it all, the factories still hissed, their stacks releasing plumes of pale smoke that spread invisibly through the fog, dissolving into the lungs of the living. Ether had become London's unacknowledged element. It rose from the river, from the chimneys, from the cracks of every window left ajar. The entire city breathed as one, slowly, drowsily, obediently. At night, the lamps burned lower. Theatre audiences no longer cheered. They sighed. Ballrooms emptied earlier. Dinners passed in strange, languid conversation. Even laughter had grown slower, the punchlines arriving as if through water. "The whole of London is sleepwalking," wrote one observer, "and we who are awake are outnumbered." Sir Tobias Venn, the former head of the Chemists' Guild, tried to reignite the city's appetite. He hosted a grand exhibition at the Crystal Palace titled "The Triumph of Tranquility," where visitors could stroll through halls perfumed with faint vapor while viewing mechanical wonders powered by refined combustion. He died before the exhibition closed, found in his private carriage, with the curtains drawn and a smile on his lips. The newspapers called it an appropriate ending. The public called it poetic. The government said nothing. The ministers still debated industrial miasmas, but avoided the word ether entirely. Officially, it no longer existed. Unofficially, it had become the bloodstream of the empire. Ships carried barrels of it across oceans, labeled as medical supply. Colonies reported receiving the same sickness traders in Calcutta and Cape Town, describing fainting fits, trembling hands, and dreams that felt more real than waking. London had exported its silence. Even the churches felt it. Attendance dropped, not from disbelief, but from apathy. Congregations sat through sermons with half-lidded eyes, nodding at the word Amen like sleepers answering their names. Priests found themselves pausing mid-sentence, forgetting the line they had just spoken. Some said the Holy Spirit had fled the city. Others whispered that it was still here, only slower, quieter, dulled by the same sweetness that hung everywhere. The only voices left were those of the children, their songs drifting faintly through the streets. "Sleepy angels, breathe no more," they sang, a nursery rhyme born from games and funerals. On foggy nights, the sound carried far, echoing down the empty avenues until it was impossible to tell where it began. Those who still resisted few, as they were learned to fear that sound. It meant the city was dreaming again, sinking deeper into its fragrant sleep. And so London's silence became absolute, not the silence of death, but of surrender. The sound of a metropolis that had finally learned to live without the burden of feeling, the whispering breath of millions who had chosen numbness over pain. In that silence, the city still functioned. Carriages moved, lights glowed, papers were printed. But all of it happened under a great hush, as though some invisible hand had pressed a finger to its lips and said, "Enough, rest now." And London obeyed. By 1874, even the city itself seemed to remember its sins. The streets of London, slick with winter rain and soot, carried a faint, unnatural sweetness that could not be washed away. The gas lamps glimmered through the fog, casting a pale gold over cobblestones that were perpetually damp, perpetually fragrant. It was as if the very stones had absorbed the memory of every inhalation, every stolen breath of ether that had passed through the drawing rooms, laboratories, and parlors of the elite. The scent lingered, subtle and unrelenting, an invisible witness to the century's indulgences. Those who lived near the old Bloomsbury studios and Mayfair townhouses were the first to notice it. Housewives complained that their curtains smelled faintly floral, even after they were washed. Footmen observed that the floors retained the chill sweetness long after the rooms had been swept. Visitors entering the city remarked on its unusual atmosphere, pleasant at first, delicate as spring blossoms, yet slightly off, unsettling, like perfume left on a corpse. They did not know that they were inhaling the ghosts of a generation's obsession. The chemists had vanished into obscurity, their warehouses emptied, their secret ledgers destroyed. Dr. Elwood, long since disappeared, was remembered in whispers as the man who had taught London to forget itself. The Society of Breath had dissolved quietly, but their influence lingered in every household that had once indulged in ritual inhalations. The children who had played Sleepy Angel were now adults, carrying with them the same trembling hands and drowsy eyes. The city itself exhaled the memory of them. In the theatres, audiences no longer cheered with full enthusiasm. Patrons inhaled subtly as they entered, drawn to the familiar fragrance that hovered near the velvet curtains and polished floors. Actors remarked that applause felt lighter, voices less resonant. It was as if every note, every movement, had been tempered by decades of vapor that had seeped into the very architecture. London had been trained to move more slowly, to breathe in rhythm with the scent itself, to respond to pleasure with moderation born not of discipline, but of chemical memory. Even the river seemed touched. Fishermen spoke of a faint sweetness rising from the Thames on still mornings, lingering just above the water like mist. Sailors claimed the fog carried hints of lilac and iron along the docks. Merchants returning from the provinces noted the smell clinging to their clothing as though the city refused to let them leave untouched. London had become a city that breathed not only for its people, but of them. The elite attempted to ignore it, even as the memory of their lost vigor and trembling hands returned in gusts of the familiar fragrance. They told themselves that the scent was nothing more than a trick of the air, that decay could not smell so sweet. But everyone who walked through the streets could feel it, an invisible pulse beneath the mundane, a reminder of the lives spent chasing oblivion through a mist they had helped create. And so the city moved forward in its quiet obsession, a metropolis alive with ghosts. Every breath drawn was a testament to the past. Every sigh carried the memory of euphoria and ruin intertwined. The scent lingered, subtle, relentless, and eternal, the invisible perfume of London's beautiful decay, a reminder that even after decades, the past does not vanish. It simply waits, patient, in the air we breathe. By 1875, London's haunted perfume had achieved its most insidious form. Memory, the scent of ether long past its legal battles, long past its public scandal, persisted like a whisper through every drawing room, every theatre, every street corner. Gentlemen and ladies of the city no longer spoke of it openly. It had become a private companion, subtle and unacknowledged, yet impossible to ignore. Visitors from abroad remarked upon the peculiar sweetness that hung in the air, a fragrance faintly metallic, floral, and chillingly persistent. Few realized they were inhaling history itself, the ghosts of every inhalation, every trembling hand, every gasp of delight and terror the city had ever produced. The elite, once the inventors of indulgence, had learned to live with it as quietly as one lives with a shadow. Some swore that the scent followed them from room to room, brushing against their hair, clinging to their gloves and silk gowns. Others reported waking in the early hours with a faint thrill of memory, eyes half closed, recalling the long-ago exhalations that had carried them into their first dream-induced faint. Each inhalation had left a mark on the city, and the city, in turn, left its mark on them. Even those who had never indulged directly felt its presence. In the hospitals, nurses noticed the lingering sweetness in linen drawers. The staff at street, Margaret's asylum commented that the corridors seemed thicker, slower, as if the air itself remembered the rhythm of lost breaths. Children in the streets, now grown, would sometimes pause and inhale deeply, a faint blush crossing their cheeks, recalling the ghostly games of Sleepy Angel, the same vaporous mischief that had taught them both pleasure and fear. Artists, too, found themselves caught in the scent's memory. Paintings created decades earlier seemed to glow faintly in candlelight, colors shifting as if alive. Those who had once inhaled before beginning a canvas swore that the brushstrokes whispered to them in the same tones they had felt long ago, guiding their hands toward visions not entirely of this world. Critics were enchanted, convinced the city had birthed a new school of genius. They had no idea the true inspiration was chemical memory, a ghostly presence that moved through pigment and vapor alike. Even the clergy could not escape it. The pews of street martins and street Pauls were perfumed by decades of devotion mixed with indulgence. Congregants inhaled without knowing, responding to sermons with voices hushed yet attentive, swayed by a rhythm older than the words themselves. Some priests whispered that the scent was proof of divine presence. Others feared it was a reminder that the city had chosen oblivion over virtue. And so the ghosts persisted, intangible yet undeniable. They drifted along the Thames, threading through the fog-laden streets, curling around the lampposts, brushing past the mouths and noses of Londoners as they went about their daily lives. The city exhaled constantly, a living archive of desire, fear, and the pursuit of sweetness. By evening, the wind carried it further, past the river, into the suburbs, until it mingled with the countryside's fresh air, a subtle memory creeping into every inhalation. London had become a mausoleum not of bodies, but of breath. The ghosts of sweet vitriol, 100,000 moments of euphoria, fear, and surrender, lingering eternally in the air, waiting for anyone willing to inhale history itself. By the winter of 1876, the city of London had become an organism entirely attuned to its own ghosts. The fog that rolled off the Thames was no longer merely water and soot. It carried the memory of every inhalation, every gasp, every trembling hand that had ever sought the elusive comfort of ether. The air itself seemed alive, a reservoir of centuries' worth of sweet intoxication. The city no longer needed its bottles, its salons, its secret gatherings. London remembered for its citizens. In a small shuttered townhouse on the edge of Bloomsbury, the last known practitioners of inhalation, two elderly women who had once belonged to the Society of Breath, sat quietly before a single lamp. Their vials were empty, yet the scent remained thick in the air, curling around their necks, lingering in their hair, invisible and persistent. They had learned to breathe it without the substance, to draw in the city's memory of pleasure and surrender, to close their eyes and feel it fold into their lungs. Across town, a young boy in Whitechapel paused in the morning mist. He had never seen the grand salons, never met the poets, never inhaled from a glass decanter. Yet, as he lifted a scarf to his nose, the air hit him with faint sweetness, a trace of lilacs and iron. His knees buckled, a smile crept across his face, and he sat on the curb, imagining a city of endless light, endless calm. He had inhaled nothing at all, only the ghosts of centuries. The churches, once filled with vibrant voices, were hushed now. The few who attended knelt, inhaling faintly through the fog that seeped beneath the stained glass windows. They whispered prayers that had been repeated for decades, their lips moving in rhythm with a rhythm already set by the city itself. Even the clergy felt it. The air of absolution mingled with the perfume of memory. Hospitals reported fewer patients, but each room carried its own history. Nurses would enter a ward to find the faint shimmer of ether clinging to the linens, the walls, even the lampstands. Some patients admitted they felt calm just from inhaling the air, not the substance. The city had become a laboratory of ghosts, every inhalation an experiment perfected over decades. The river mirrored the winter sky, grey and still, yet carried its own trace of memory. Fishermen reported that the water seemed heavier, denser, imbued with sweetness that rose in spirals when the tide was low. Sailors swore that it was impossible to cross the Thames without inhaling it, and even the fresh air of the countryside carried a faint trace, drifting down the river, over the hills, into the lungs of those who had never known the city. And so it continued, silent and eternal. London exhaled constantly, the ghosts of every inhalation intertwined with the breath of the living. For the citizens, it was a comfort, a lullaby, a slow reminder of what had been and what would never truly vanish. In the end, there were no more bottles, no more secret gatherings, no more flamboyant scandals. The city itself had absorbed them all. Every wall, every floorboard, every shadowed corridor held the memory. The air itself had become the final practitioner, offering the last inhalation to anyone willing to breathe. London's century of vapor, of obsession, of sweetness and ruin, had passed from hands to lungs to atmosphere. The city inhaled, and in that final breath it remembered everything: beauty, decay, laughter, trembling hands, and the quiet, eternal surrender of a civilization that had learned to forget itself, and had done so with grace.